Calder Briggs' hand closed around the little girl's arm like a trap snapping shut. Maisie Hollister didn't scream. She was too frightened for that. She just went rigid, 8 years old, and soaking wet from the storm, her boots sliding in the mud as the Silver Mesa foreman dragged her toward the gate, like she was a stray dog he'd caught raiding the kitchen. "I told you once," Briggs said, loud enough for every man in the yard to hear. "Children don't belong on working land." That was the moment Wade Hollister came around the corner of the stable. And that was the moment everything changed. If you've ever watched a man lose the last thing holding him together and somehow find something harder underneath, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Wyoming. 1883 and a cold October storm that rearranged everything. Wade Hollister had been working Silver Mesa Ranch for 11 years. He knew every fence line on the property. He knew which section of the north pasture went soft after heavy rain, which water trough froze first in November, which horses spooked at nothing, and which ones you could trust in a lightning storm. He knew the smell of the bunkhouse on cold mornings, wood smoke, boot leather, the particular sourness of men who worked hard and slept poorly. He knew all of it, the way you know something you've given your best years to, without ever being asked if you were willing. He had not been willing, exactly. He had been desperate. There was a difference, and 11 years in, he understood it clearly. His wife Clara had died of fever when Maisie was 14 months old. Wade had held that baby through 3 nights of his own grief before he'd understood that grief was a luxury he couldn't afford yet. He'd taken the Silver Mesa job because it came with a bunk room barely large enough for a cot and a wooden chest, and the foreman at the time, a decent man named Pryor, who'd since moved on to Montana, had told him quietly that nobody was going to say anything about a man keeping his infant daughter in a room that size if he kept his head down and did his work. Wade had kept his head down for 11 years. He'd done his work and then some. The morning the storm rolled in off the mountains, Wade had already been up since 4. He'd repaired a split in the waterline feeding the east horse pen, packed the gap with river clay, strips of burlap he'd cut from an old feed sack, and gotten the water flowing again, before the other hands were even pulling on their boots. It was the kind of work that never appeared on any ledger. It was the kind of work Calder Briggs had never once acknowledged in the 3 years since he'd replaced Pryor as foreman. Calder Briggs was the sort of man who noticed everything and credited nothing. He was 44, built like a fence post, tall, narrow, and unyielding, with a pale, long-jawed face that never quite relaxed. He'd arrived at Silver Mesa with excellent references from 2 ranches in Colorado that nobody had thought to verify, and he'd spent his first 6 months being impressively efficient. Cut costs. He'd reorganized the cattle rotation. He'd handled disputes between ranch hands with a cold authority that the owner, Mrs. Harrowell, had interpreted as competence. What she hadn't seen, what nobody had managed to make her see, was what happened after Briggs closed the account books for the night. But that morning, Wade wasn't thinking about Briggs. He was thinking about Maisie. She'd been coughing for 2 days, a dry, persistent sound that had kept Wade awake, listening to it through the thin wall between the bunkhouse main room and her sleeping space, a curtain corner he'd built out with salvaged planks 3 years back. Just enough room for a narrow bed and her small chest of belongings. Maisie had Clara's dark hair and Wade's stubbornness, a combination that meant she'd insisted she was fine through both days of coughing and had woken that morning already dressed, already determined to spend the day in the stable, helping old Perkins clean the tack. Wade had told her to stay close. He hadn't told her to stay inside, which was his mistake, and he knew it the moment he came around the stable corner and saw Calder Briggs holding his daughter by the arm. The storm had blown in fast. The sky had gone from gray to the color of a bruise in less than an hour, and the rain was now coming sideways, cold enough to bite. Most of the ranch hands had retreated to the equipment barn. The yard was nearly empty except for Briggs and Maisie and 2 younger cowboys standing back near the fence, watching with the careful blankness of men who'd learned not to get involved in anything the foreman started. Maisie wasn't crying. That was the thing that hit Wade hardest. She'd learned not to cry around Briggs. She'd learned that the way children learn things when adults teach them, without knowing they're teaching anything at all, by watching what happened to people who showed softness in front of him. She was standing rigid, her arm in Briggs' grip, her wet hair plastered against her face, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way Wade had seen horses go when they were too frightened to move. "Brig," Wade said. His voice came out flat, not loud. Not angry, not yet, though the anger was there, crouched low in his chest like something waiting to be let out. He'd spent 11 years keeping that particular thing caged, and he was still working on it, still measuring, still calculating what he could afford. Brig looked at him without releasing Maisie's arm. "There's your girl," Brig said pleasantly. "Found her in the stable. Told you before, Hollister. Children are a distraction on working land." She was helping Perkins with the tack. She wasn't bothering anybody. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Briggs' jaw shifted. It was a small movement, the kind most people would have missed. Wade had been watching Brig for 3 years, and he didn't miss it. "The point," Briggs said, "is that this is a working ranch, not a nursery. She needs to go inside. Then let go of her arm and she'll walk inside herself." 2 young cowboys by the fence were very still. Brig looked at Wade for a moment. Then, with the particular deliberateness of a man who wants you to understand he's choosing his next action rather than being forced into it, he tightened his grip on Maisie's arm and began pulling her toward the gate, not toward the main house, not toward shelter, but toward the gate that opened onto the road. Maisie made a sound then, not a cry, more like the sound a person makes when they've stepped on something unexpected in the dark. Wade crossed the yard in 4 steps. He put himself between Brig and the gate. He was not a tall man. Brig had 4 inches on him, but he was built from 11 years of physical labor, and he stood like something that had decided not to move and meant it. "Take your hand off my daughter," he said. Something shifted in Briggs' face. Not anger, something colder than anger. "You're making a mistake, Hollister." "Might be. Take your hand off her. This is a conversation about ranch policy. I suggest you..." "I'm not having a conversation with you about anything while you're holding on to her like that." Briggs stared at him. The rain hammered the yard. Somewhere in the equipment barn, a horse kicked against its stall. Then Brig released Maisie's arm. She moved immediately to Wade's side, and he put his hand on her shoulder without looking down at her, a light touch, meant to be steadying. "Here's what's going to happen," Briggs said. "You're going to take that child and get off this property. Tonight, both of you." Wade felt Maisie go still under his hand. "On what grounds?" he said. "On the grounds that I'm the foreman of Silver Mesa Ranch, and I'm telling you to go. Mrs. Harrowell hired me. Mrs. Harrowell trusts me to manage her labor. That includes deciding who stays and who goes." Briggs' voice hadn't risen. It never did. That was one of the things that made him effective. "You've got 2 hours. I'll have your wages settled by then." Wade looked at him for a long moment. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the water line he'd fixed that morning before sunrise, the fences he'd mended on his own time, the winter 2 years back when he'd stayed up 3 nights running to help pull calves during an early blizzard because there hadn't been enough experienced hands, and the cattle were Silver Mesa's lifeblood, and he'd understood that even when Brig apparently hadn't. He thought about Maisie's cough, about the curtain corner with the narrow bed. "You can take my wages," Wade said. "You can take my bunk." He felt Maisie's hand find his, small fingers curling around 3 of his. "But you don't put your hands on my daughter," Briggs smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. 2 hours, he said, and walked away. The 2 cowboys by the fence were studying the ground with great concentration. Wade stood in the rain for a moment, Maisie's hand in his, and then he looked down at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said immediately. "You hurt?" She considered this honestly. "My arm's a little sore." "Okay," he squeezed her hand once. "Let's go pack." They owned less than he'd sometimes thought, and slightly more than he'd feared. Wade's worldly possessions, accumulated over 41 years of living and 11 of them on Silver Mesa, fit into 1 saddlebag and 1 canvas sack. Maisie's fit into a smaller canvas sack and the battered carpet bag that had belonged to Clara, the one with the brass clasp that Maisie polished whenever she thought Wade wasn't watching. The bunkhouse was empty when they packed. Most of the hands were in the equipment barn waiting out the storm. A few had seen what happened in the yard word would travel at the speed it always traveled in places like this, which was fast and not always accurate. By supper, the story would have 6 different versions. By morning, most of the hands would have quietly decided not to get involved, because most of them had their own situations they couldn't afford to risk. Wade understood that. He didn't hold it against them. He saddled his horse, his own horse, a bay gelding named Patch, who'd been with him for 7 years, and was in the no-sense-of-humor way of certain horses, genuinely one of the more trustworthy creatures Wade had ever known, and he lifted Maisie up behind him and they rode out through Silver Mesa's main gate as the rain began to ease into something gray and persistent. Maisie didn't ask where they were going. She was 8 years old and she understood some things about their situation, with a clarity that occasionally troubled Wade, the clarity children develop when their circumstances require them to pay close attention to adult decisions that affect them directly. She knew they had money enough for perhaps 3 weeks, if they were careful. She knew Wade was capable enough to find work somewhere, because he always had been. She knew that finding work that also came with a place for her to sleep was harder, and she knew this without having been told, which meant she'd figured it out from watching. She pressed her cheek against Wade's back as Patch walked the muddy road south. "Papa," she said after a while. "Yeah, he does it to other people too, you know. Not just me." Wade's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "What do you mean?" "I've seen him grab at the Mexican hands when he thinks nobody's looking. And there's a boy over in the bunkhouse. One of the young ones, Perkins' nephew Brig, makes him do the bad jobs, the ones nobody else wants to do, and if he doesn't do them fast enough, Brig..." She stopped. "Brig what?" "He doesn't hit," Maisie said carefully. "But he gets real close, right up close, and he talks quiet." Wade didn't say anything for a moment. "You should have told me," he said. "I didn't want you to do what you just did." That's sat between them for a minute. "Fair point," Wade said. The eating house was 3 miles down the valley road, a low, square building run by a widow named Dorothea Spence, who served 2 meals a day and didn't ask questions about why you looked the way you looked when you came through the door. Wade had eaten there a handful of times over the years, never enough to be a regular, just enough that Dorothea recognized his face and gave him a corner table without comment. He told Maisie he'd already eaten. She looked at him with the particular expression she'd inherited from Clara Flat. Unconvinced look that suggested she was letting it go for now, but hadn't forgotten anything. And then she looked at the single plate of beef stew Dorothea set down and ate with the concentrated focus of a child who was genuinely hungry and had decided to believe him, or had decided it was kinder to pretend she did. Wade drank coffee and watched the window and tried to think through the practical problem of what came next. There were 2 other ranches in the valley he could approach, though both were smaller than Silver Mesa, and one of them he knew to be struggling. He could go north to the next territory, but that meant riding through weather that was only going to get worse as autumn pushed toward winter, and he didn't love the idea of Maisie on horseback in freezing temperatures for 3 days. He was still working through the problem when the door opened and let in a gust of cold air, and the woman who changed everything. He didn't recognize her at first. He'd seen Vivian Harrowell 3 times in 11 years, which should have told him something about how Silver Mesa was being run most ranch owners with that much land, and that many employees made a point of knowing their people. But Vivian had been in the East for much of the past few years following her husband's death, and before that she'd relied entirely on Pryor and then Brig to manage the day-to-day work. She was 35, which meant she'd been widowed at 32, and she carried that the way some women did not visibly, not in any way she was advertising, but there in the set of her shoulders and the quality of her attention, a person who'd learned to be careful about what she let herself count on. She was dressed well, but not extravagantly, a dark traveling coat, good boots, hair pinned back with the practical efficiency of someone who cared about appearance without being ruled by it. She came into the eating house, looked around once, and walked directly to Wade's table. Stood up, the way his mother had raised him to do, and waited for her to speak first. "Mr. Hollister," she said. "Ma'am, may I sit?" The question surprised him. He'd expected accusation and extension of Briggs' version, delivered with the authority of ownership. Instead, she asked permission, and she asked it looking directly at him, not at the table or the room or the middle distance. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and pulled out the chair across from Maisie. Vivian sat. She looked at Maisie for a moment, a level, assessing look with no performance in it, and then she looked back at Wade. "I saw what happened in the yard," she said. Wade waited. "I was in the upstairs room, the east window. I watched the whole thing." She paused. "I want to understand why you never came to me before today. Any of it the way Calder handles the workers, the things your daughter just described in the yard." She stopped again. "I was close enough to hear most of it." Wade studied her face. He was looking for the angle, the thing she actually wanted, the position she was maneuvering toward. He'd spent enough years dealing with people who had power over him to have developed a reasonably accurate sense of when he was being managed. He wasn't getting that from her. He was getting something that looked like genuine bewilderment, which worried him almost as much, because it meant she either didn't know or had chosen not to know, and he wasn't sure yet which was true. "'Cause," he said, "men in my position, who make complaints to owners about their foreman, tend to find themselves without positions shortly after." But Calder was Mrs. Harrowell. He said it without edge. "Respect. I've watched 3 men try to raise concerns with ranch management over the past 3 years. 2 of them were gone within a month. The 3rd is still there, but he doesn't raise concerns anymore." Vivian was quiet. "And you have Maisie to think about," she said. "Always." She looked at the little girl again. Maisie was watching Vivian with the frank interest of a child who had decided to evaluate this person carefully and had not yet reached a verdict. "I'd like to offer you your position back," Vivian said. "No, thank you," Wade said. She blinked. He suspected not many people said that to her. "Mr. Hollister, I won't raise my daughter somewhere. She gets treated like a problem to be solved. That was true this morning, and it'll be true tomorrow morning if I go back to the same situation." He kept his voice level. "I appreciate the offer." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Could see her thinking, actually thinking, not just formulating a response. Then she looked at Maisie. "What's your name?" she asked. "Maisie Hollister," Maisie said. "How old are you?" 8. Almost 8.5. "Do you like horses?" Maisie's expression shifted toward something less guarded. "Yes, ma'am. Papa's teaching me to tell a good hoof from a bad one." "Is he?" Vivian looked back at Wade. "Then I'd like to change my offer." "Ma'am, I'm not offering to hire one Hollister back. I'm offering to hire both of you." She put her hands flat on the table, a deliberate gesture, the kind that meant, "I want you to take this seriously. I need someone who actually understands my horse operation, because apparently what I thought was being managed was not being managed at all. That's Wade Hollister." She glanced at Maisie. "And I need someone Maisie's age to make use of the lessons my bookkeeper's wife is already giving her own children." That is also, apparently, Maisie Hollister. Wade looked at his daughter. Maisie was very carefully not looking at him, which meant she was trying very hard not to influence him, which meant she wanted to say yes, badly enough, that she'd decided the honorable thing was to let him decide on his own. "A safe room," Wade said. "In the main house, not the bunkhouse." "Yes. She eats with the household, not apart from it." "Of course. If Brigg or anyone else puts their hands on her or speaks to her with disrespect, I walk." Same day. No argument, no explanation owed. Vivian didn't hesitate. "Agreed. And I want to understand what's actually happening to that ranch before I agree to anything else." He watched her face. "Because what I know about Silver Mesa tells me there are problems that go beyond Calder Brigg being unpleasant to children." There was a pause. Something changed in Vivian's expression, not surprise exactly. More like the look of someone who's been carrying a suspicion alone for a long time and has just heard someone else name it. "What do you know?" she asked. "I know your cattle numbers have been dropping for 2 years. I know the east pasture fencing has needed 3 repairs in one season on sections that shouldn't have needed 1. I know the winter hay stores were short last year and nobody could tell me why, because the purchasing record said we'd ordered enough and the money had certainly been spent." He watched her carefully. "I know that some of that hay did get purchased. I also know it didn't all end up at Silver Mesa." Vivian was very still. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I delivered a load of emergency feed to the Dalton spread in January, on Brigg's orders." Except when I got there, Old Man Dalton said he hadn't ordered any feed. Said he'd been paying Silver Mesa for feed all winter. Wade paused. Told Brig. He told me I'd misunderstood the arrangement. 2 days later, he moved me from general cattle work to the horse operation. He moved you. Out of the way, Wade said. That's my read. The eating house was quiet around them. Dorothea Spence was doing something industrious behind the counter and not visibly paying attention, which probably meant she was paying close attention. Vivian's hands, still flat on the table, pressed down slightly. Come back to Silver Mesa, she said, both of you, and help me understand what's been happening to my ranch. Wade looked at his daughter one more time. Maisie was studying the last of her beef stew with tremendous concentration. Maisie, Wade said. I'm not saying anything, she said immediately. I know. I'm asking anyway. She looked up. Her dark eyes, so much like Clara's that it still caught him sometimes, moved between him and Vivian. She asked if she could sit with us, Maisie said. And she didn't have to ask. It wasn't an argument for anything in particular. But it was Maisie's way of saying she'd noticed something. Wade looked back at Vivian Harrowell. All right, he said. We'll come back. They rode out to Silver Mesa in the late afternoon, the rain having settled into a thin gray drizzle that blurred the mountain line to the west. Vivian had gone ahead in her carriage. Wade and Maisie followed on Patch, which was partly practical and partly because Wade wanted time to think before arriving. Papa, Maisie said from her position behind him. Yeah, what does she want? Same thing she said she wants. What if it's not? Then we'll know soon enough. Maisie was quiet for a moment. Old Perkins said once that rich people always want something, and the thing they say they want isn't ever the real thing they want. Perkins is a man who's had some disappointments, Wade said. He's not wrong, though, is he? Not always, no. So what do you think she actually wants? Wade thought about it. He thought about the way Vivian had sat across from him and asked permission to do so. He thought about her hands flat on the table and the particular quality of stillness in her face when he described the January feed delivery, not the stillness of someone hearing something for the first time, but the stillness of someone recognizing something they'd suspected. I think she wants her ranch back, he said. I think someone's been stealing it from her while she wasn't looking, and I think part of her's been telling her something was wrong, and she hasn't known who to ask. And she's asking you. Seems like it. Why you? Because I'm apparently the only one around here dumb enough to say no to her when she offered me something. Maisie laughed a short, surprised sound. Then that's not dumb. No, Wade agreed. Probably not. Brig was standing in the yard when they arrived. He watched Wade dismount with an expression that contained several things: anger, calculation, and underneath both of those, something that might have been the first edge of real concern. Whatever Brig had expected from firing Wade Hollister, it hadn't been this. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Vivian came out of the main house and stood on the porch. Mr. Hollister will be taking over supervision of the horse operation, she said, at a volume that carried clearly across the yard. Maisie will be housed in the east guest room until we can arrange something more suitable. She looked at Brig with a directness that hadn't been there before, or had been there all along, and had just for the first time decided to be visible. Calder, I'd like to see the full accounting books. All of them. Tonight. Brig's jaw shifted. Of course, he said smoothly. I'll have them ready after supper. Wade led Patch toward the stable. As he passed Brig, the foreman's voice came low and even, pitched for Wade's ears only. You made a mistake coming back. Wade didn't stop walking. Might be, he said, same as he'd said it before. We'll see. The east guest room was small but solid and real, 4 walls, a door with a latch, a window that looked out toward the foothills. There was a proper bed, not a cot, and a washstand, and a braided rug on the floor. Maisie stood in the middle of it for a moment after Wade set down her carpet bag. It has a door, she said. Yeah, a real one with a latch. I see it. She walked to the window and looked out at the foothills in the evening gray. Papa, she said. Yeah, Maisie, I think I like her. Wade stood in the doorway and watched his daughter look out at a view she hadn't had before, from a room with a latching door. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, he said. But he was already thinking about the account books, and the feed delivery in January, and the 3 years of quiet, incremental damage that Calder Brigg had been doing to a ranch, Wade had given his own best years to without asking for recognition. He was thinking about cattle numbers and fence sections and hay that hadn't arrived where it was supposed to arrive. He was thinking about what it meant that someone had been picking Silver Mesa apart from the inside, carefully, slowly, in a way designed to look like ordinary misfortune. He was thinking about who would do that and why and how long they'd been doing it and what they were planning to do when they finished. And he was starting to understand, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 11 years paying close attention to a place he cares about, that what had happened in the yard that morning, what had gotten him fired in the rain, in front of 2 frightened cowboys, had not been an accident of bad temper. It had been Calder Brigg trying to get rid of the one man on Silver Mesa who knew enough to be dangerous. Wade Hollister looked at his daughter standing at her window. Then he went to find out what was in those account books. The account books were wrong. Not obviously wrong, not the kind of wrong that jumped out at you if you glanced at a page and moved on. The kind of wrong that required sitting with a lamp pulled close and a finger moving down column after column, cross-referencing numbers against each other until the discrepancies started emerging the way shapes and suffrage from darkness when your eyes adjust. Subtle wrong, patient wrong. The kind of wrong that had been constructed carefully by someone who understood that the best lies look like arithmetic errors. Wade had found 3 of them before midnight, sitting at the small desk in the room Vivian had designated as a temporary office, a converted storage room off the main house corridor, smelling of cedar and old paper. The books themselves were leather-bound, heavy, the entries written in a neat hand that Wade recognized as Briggs. He'd seen the foreman's handwriting on purchase orders and work assignments for 3 years. He knew the particular way Brigg formed his 7s, the slight backward lean of his capital letters. He sat back in the chair and looked at what he'd found and thought about what it meant. The first discrepancy was the winter hay. The books showed a purchase of 400 bales from a supplier in Cody, paid in full, received and stored at Silver Mesa's North Hay barn. Wade had personally helped unload hay from 2 wagons that January. He'd counted the bales himself because it was cold and he was moving fast, and counting was something to do with his hands. He'd counted 212 bales. He remembered it precisely because the number had seemed low for the price, and he'd meant to ask Perkins about it, and then the calving emergency had started and he'd forgotten. 212 bales received, 400 bales on the books. The difference was not a rounding error. The second discrepancy was the cattle count from the previous spring, a roll call of Silver Mesa's herd done each April. The books recorded 840 head. Wade had been part of that count. He'd worked the east section with 2 other hands, and they'd pushed every animal through the count gate and kept tally. His section had come up 60 short of what the book said it should have contributed. He'd told Brigg. Brigg had told him cattle strayed, which was true, and that the count included animals from the west section that hadn't been recorded separately, which might have been true and might not. The third discrepancy was harder to define but worse in some ways. It was a series of payments to a firm called Cornerstone Supply out of Laramie regular, quarterly, for the purchase of equipment, replacement tack, and fence materials. The payments were real. The name was real. But when Wade went back through his 11 years of practical knowledge of Silver Mesa's infrastructure, he couldn't account for most of what Cornerstone Supply was supposed to have delivered. The equipment wasn't there. The tack wasn't there. The fence materials he had spent 11 years maintaining Silver Mesa's fencing, and he knew what had been replaced and when and with what, and what the books were claiming did not match what he'd done with his own hands. He was still sitting with these 3 facts arranged in his mind when the door opened. Vivian came in without knocking, which he suspected was because this was her house, and she'd been used to going where she wanted in it. She had a shawl over her shoulders and a second lamp in her hand, and her hair was down, which made her look younger and less composed and somehow more real. Stopped when she saw his face. "You found something," she said. "Yes, ma'am. How bad?" Wade looked at the book spread across the desk. Then he looked at her. "Sit down," he said. It occurred to him halfway through saying it that it was a forward thing to say to a woman in her own house, but she pulled the chair from the corner and sat down across from him without comment. and he decided she was the kind of person who valued directness over ceremony, which was another thing in her favor. He walked her through what he'd found. He was methodical about it, not because he was a methodical man by nature, but because he understood that what he was describing was serious and deserved to be laid out carefully. He showed her the hay numbers. He walked her through the cattle count. He went line by line through 6 quarters of cornerstone supply payments and told her, from his own 11 years of working the land, what had not arrived that the books said should have. Vivian didn't interrupt him. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving between his face and the pages, and she was quiet in a way that had weight in it, the quiet of someone absorbing something they'd been half expecting and dreading fully. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "How long?" she asked. "The cornerstone payments go back further than what I can speak to personally. The patterns I can verify from my own work, at least 2 years. Possibly 3. The whole time Calder's been here." "Yes, ma'am." She stood up, walked to the small window. The glass showed her reflection, back at her a woman in a shawl, holding a lamp, standing in a room that smelled of cedar. "My husband trusted him," she said. "Arthur brought him in from Colorado a year before he died. He said Calder's was the best ranch manager he'd encountered in 20 years of cattle work. With respect, did he check those Colorado references himself?" Pause. "No, he had a man in Denver do it." "What man?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't know," she said. "Arthur handled it." She turned from the window. "I handled the finances, supposedly, but I was managing the house accounts and the Eastern investments. Arthur managed the operational side." Her voice had an edge to it, not at Wade, at herself. "And then Arthur died, and I trusted Calder to keep it running. While I was still—" She stopped. Started again. "While I was dealing with other things." "You were grieving," Wade said. "I was also being careless," she said flatly. "Don't dress it up for me. I should have been paying closer attention." He didn't argue with her. She wasn't wrong, and she didn't seem like a woman who wanted to be told she wasn't wrong when she was. "Question now," he said, "is what we do about it. We go to the sheriff." "With what?" "What I've got right now is accounting discrepancies and my personal recollection of bail counts from last January. Brigg will say the records reflect legitimate business decisions I wasn't privy to. He'll have an answer for every line I can point to because he's had 3 years to construct those answers." Wade shook his head. "We need more. We need something he can't explain away." Vivian looked at him steadily. "What kind of something?" "Cattle that's gone missing didn't vanish. It went somewhere. If it was sold off the books, someone bought it and someone paid for it, and that money went somewhere." He tapped the Cornerstone Supply entries. "Same with this. There's a firm in Laramie receiving regular payments from Silver Mesa. Either they're real and they've been delivering to somewhere other than here, or they're not real and the money's been redirected. Either way, there's a trail." "How do you know there's a trail?" "He's covered everything in the books." "'Cause," Wade said, "men who steal slowly and carefully over years do it that way because they're planning to keep doing it. They maintain records of what they've actually done, separate from the records they show you. Because they need to know where everything is and where everything went. You can't manage a scheme like this out of your head." He looked at her. "He has papers somewhere, his own papers. Not these." Vivian stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I don't know it," he said. "But I'd bet on it." The silence stretched between them. The lamp on the desk guttered slightly in a draft from somewhere. "All right," Vivian said. "Then we need to find them before he realizes we're looking." "Yes, ma'am. And we need to keep him from realizing anything's changed. That's the harder part." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that territory. "I suspect you're better at that than I am. I'm better at keeping my face still," he said. "Not sure that's a gift I'm proud of. It's a gift we need." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Mr. Hollister, what you showed me tonight, why didn't you take it to a lawyer? Or write to the Territorial Land Office? Why stay on a ranch where you knew something was wrong and nobody was addressing it?" It was a fair question. He thought about how to answer it honestly. "'Cause the ranch employs 32 people," he said. "And most of them have families. And I watched what happened to Silver Mesas during the 2 years before Brigg arrived, when it was being properly run, the wages paid on time, the families in decent housing. the work that was hard but fair. And then I watched Briggs start taking pieces of it apart, and I thought, if I leave, there's nobody left who knows enough to see what he's doing, and once it collapses, those 32 people and their families are the ones who pay. He paused. I know it sounds like exactly what it is, Vivian said quietly. She left. Wade sat with the account books for another hour, making notes in the margins of a blank feed ledger he'd found in the desk drawer shorthand only, nothing that would be clear to anyone else. He was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who'd been running on tension for most of a day, but sleep wasn't available yet. His mind kept working through the geometry of what Briggs was doing, mapping it against his practical knowledge of Silver Mesa, the way you'd map terrain against a drawing to find where the drawing was wrong. Cattle, the hay, the equipment payments, those were the visible pieces. What he couldn't see yet was the shape of the whole thing what Briggs was building toward. Because slow, careful theft over years wasn't its own end. It was preparation for something. He just didn't know what yet. Morning came gray and cold, the storm having blown through overnight and left a sky the color of old iron. Wade was in the horse barn before first light, which was where he wanted to be visibly occupied, visibly normal, visible in exactly the place Briggs would expect him to be after being given the horse operation to supervise. He worked methodically through the stalls, checking water and hay, assessing each animal with the attention he always gave horses, because horses required it and rewarded it in ways that were different from cattle. He'd always had a feel for them. He could tell from the way a horse held its head how it was doing in ways that saved time later. What he was actually doing while his hands worked was watching the ranch yard. Briggs came out of the foreman's quarters at 6:30. He spoke to two of the senior hands. Wade recognized both of them, men who'd been at Silver Mesa longer than 3 years, and whose relationship with Briggs had shifted over time from neutral to something more complicated. He pointed toward the north pasture. The hands nodded and went. Then Briggs walked toward the main house. Wade kept his eyes on the horse he was examining, a gray mare with a bad front shoe that someone had half-fixed and left, and listened to the sound of footsteps on the frost-hard ground. Old Perkins appeared at the barn door 20 minutes later. He was a compact, weathered man of about 60, who had worked horses all his life and had the permanently stooped posture of someone who'd spent decades bending to deal with hooves. He looked at Wade the way he'd looked at him the day before carefully, assessing whether the situation had changed enough to require a new approach. "You're back," Perkins said. Apparently, Briggs not happy about it. I'd imagine not. Perkins came in and picked up a brush and started working on the horse in the next stall over, which told Wade he wanted to talk without looking like they were talking. "You know what you're getting into?" Perkins asked. Getting a picture of it. He's been here 3 years. He's got friends among the hands. Not the good kind of friends, the kind where they're not sure what he's got on them, and they're not prepared to find out. He's got something on some of the hands? Perkins was quiet for a moment, working the brush in steady strokes. There's a man named Colm works the west section. 3 years ago, before Briggs came, Colm had some trouble. Legal trouble, over in Cheyenne. Nothing that ever got him charged, but the kind of trouble that follows a man around. Another pause. Briggs knows about it. Colm knows Briggs knows. Who else? That's the one I know for certain. There may be others. I don't ask questions I don't want the answers to. Wade filed this away. What about outside the ranch? The neighboring cattlemen? Perkins stopped brushing for a moment. What about them? Briggs been selling cattle off the books somewhere. Not just passing them through Silver Mesa, selling them. Someone's been buying them. You'd need to talk to someone who knows the valley's trading better than I do. Perkins started brushing again. But I'll tell you this, 3 years ago, the Harker spread northeast of here had a bad season. Lost most of their breeding stock to a sickness in winter. By spring, they had a full herd again, and nobody could quite account for the recovery. Everyone figured they'd made a deal somewhere quiet. He paused. Old man Harker and Calder Briggs eat supper together in town about once a month. Wade absorbed this. You've been watching a long time, he said. I'm old, Perkins said simply. Watching is what I've got left to contribute. They worked in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the yard sounds of the morning began picking up horses being led, the clank of equipment, voices of men starting their workday. How's the girl? Perkins asked. Sleeping when I left. She's been coughing. There's something going around. My nephew had it. A pause. Good kid, my nephew. Works hard. I know, Wade said. And then carefully, Briggs been giving him the rough assignments. Perkins's brush slowed. I know that too. Why hasn't your nephew left? Because he's 22 and he needs the work, and he believes if he keeps his head down, long enough things will improve. Perkins said it without bitterness, but it landed like something heavy. Same reason most of them stay. Vivian called Brigg into the main house office at 9 o'clock. Wade didn't see this directly. He heard about it from a kitchen hand named Rosa, who told him while he was washing up the pump. In the casual way information circulated on a ranch, filtered through everyone past a doorway or window at the right moment. He was in there for almost an hour, Rosa said. She was a practical woman of about 50 with iron gray hair and the kind of eyes that notice things. Came out looking like he'd bitten into something bad. She show him the books? Rosa looked at him with mild amusement at the assumption she'd know. Couldn't hear what was said, but she had the books on the desk when I brought in the coffee. What did he look like after? Like a man doing math in his head. She shook her hands dry. Not comfortable math. Wade went back to the horse barn and thought about this. Vivian had moved faster than they'd agreed, which was either because she'd decided waiting wasn't in her character or because something had prompted her. Either way, Brigg now knew he was being looked at. That changed the timeline. He found Vivian an hour later in the kitchen garden. Of all places, walking the dead rows of what had been a kitchen garden until autumn took it, her shawl pulled tight, her boots leaving prints in the frost. You talked to him this morning, Wade said. I needed to see his face when he saw those numbers. We agreed we'd wait. You suggested we'd wait. I didn't agree to anything. She turned to face him. He looked scared, Mr. Hollister. Underneath the smooth of it, he looked scared. Which means he knows exactly what's in those books, and he knows I've been looking. Which also means he knows he needs to move faster. Yes, she said it steadily, like she'd already calculated this and accepted the cost. So do we. Wade looked at her for a moment. He was reassessing, the same way he'd been reassessing since the eating house the day before. She wasn't what he'd expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected, something softer, maybe, or something more distant. A woman who owned that much land and had that much money. But she was neither soft nor distant, and she'd moved faster than he had this morning because she'd decided the direct approach was worth the risk, which was a personality trait he recognized because he shared it, even if his circumstances had spent years training him to suppress it. All right, he said. Then we need to move on the cornerstone supply question. Today, I can send a wire to Laramie. Have someone look into whether the firm actually exists. Do it through your lawyer, not through anyone connected to the ranch. Agreed. She paused. What else? I want to search Briggs' quarters. Vivian was quiet for a moment. If he finds out, he's going to know we're looking regardless. You already showed him that this morning. Wade kept his voice even. His personal papers aren't going to be in a place I can access easily. But if there's a secondary set of records, and I believe there is, they're most likely in his quarters. He'd want them close. Can you get in there without him knowing? If I pick the right time. He'll be in the field this afternoon for the weekly pasture check. He never misses it because it's how he tracks what's going where. He'll take Colm and probably one other hand. Wade looked at the dead garden rows. That gives me an hour. I'll need to provide some reason to keep Rosa and the other house staff occupied. Can you do that without raising questions? Vivian considered this with the pragmatic calm of someone running through logistics. I'll have Rosa help me do an inventory of the supply room. It'll bore her profoundly, but she won't question it. Then we move this afternoon. She nodded. Started to turn back toward the house, then stopped. Mr. Hollister, what Perkins' nephew told Maisie about the way Calder handles some of the workers. How long has that been going on? That I know for certain? About 2 years. But Maisie's more observant than most adults give her credit for, and she's been telling me pieces of things for longer than that without knowing what she was describing. Vivian's jaw tightened slightly. He runs this place like a toll booth. Everyone passing through has to pay him something. Yes, ma'am. I don't understand how a man gets like that. I don't either, Wade said. I've stopped trying to understand it and started trying to stop it. Brigg left for the pasture check at 2 in the afternoon, as Wade had predicted, with Colm and a quiet hand named Dermot, who'd been on Silver Mesa for a year and kept to himself. Wade waited 15 minutes after they cleared the gate. Then he crossed the yard to the foreman's quarters, a separate small structure that Brigg had claimed and expanded slightly from its original use as an equipment storage room, giving it a private entrance and a heavy door with a lock that he'd installed himself. The lock was a good one, better than the ranch standard. Wade stood at the door and looked at the lock and thought for a moment. Then he went to find Perkins. "The foreman's door," he said, when he found the old man mending a bridle at his workbench. "You know much about that lock?" Perkins looked up, looked at Wade, looked back at his work. "It's a mortise lock." "Good one." He brought it with him when he came, which always seemed unusual. A man who installs his own lock on a company building. A man who planned from the beginning to have things he didn't want found. Wade stood there. Perkins worked the bridle. "There's a window," Perkins said without looking up. "North side. The latch is old original hardware. He never replaced it because it's on the side facing the woodpile, and he probably figured nobody would bother." Wade went around the north side of the foreman's quarters. The window latch was old. It took him about 45 seconds. The room smelled of tobacco and something chemical, ink maybe, or oil. It was tidier than Wade had expected. Brigg was a precise man and his space reflected it. A neatly made bed, a desk with a locked drawer, a wooden chest with another lock, a row of pegs with his coats and hats arranged in a specific order. Wade went to the desk first. The drawer lock was simpler than the door. He had it open in 2 minutes, using the point of his pocket knife and a flat piece of metal he'd taken from the barn. Inside was a bundle of papers folded tight and tied with cord. He untied the cord. The first pages were what he'd expected, a second ledger, smaller than the official books, written in Brigg's backward-leaning hand. Numbers and dates and names organized in columns that bore no resemblance to Silver Mesa's official accounts. The names were mostly unfamiliar, but 2 of them weren't. Parker appeared 6 times, with dates and amounts next to each entry. And there was a name he didn't recognize, Alderton T. W, appearing at the top of the page and recurring throughout, with larger figures attached. He turned to the next set of pages. These were letters. Not many, 6 or 7, folded separately and arranged in order. He read the first one quickly, then the second, and by the third he had a good enough picture that his hands had gone still and he was standing in the middle of Calder Brigg's room holding paper evidence of something considerably larger than simple cattle theft. Brigg wasn't just stealing from Silver Mesa, he was working toward owning it. The letters, exchanged with T.W. Alderton of Laramie, a name he'd file away to give Vivian, immediately laid it out clearly enough. Silver Mesa was being systematically devalued. The numbers were being manipulated to make the ranch appear to be failing. When the apparent failure reached the right stage, Alderton would approach Vivian Harrowell with an offer to purchase a fair offer by the standards of a failing operation, which would nonetheless be a fraction of what the ranch was actually worth. Brigg would receive a percentage of the purchase price. Alderton, whoever he was, would own Silver Mesa. The timeline, based on the most recent letter's projections, was approximately 6 months away. Wade stood in the foreman's quarters and breathed through what he'd just read. Then he folded the papers carefully, put them inside his shirt, relocked the drawer as best he could, and went back out through the window. He was across the yard and back in the horse barn before his hands stopped being quite so steady. He found Vivian still doing inventory in the supply room with a thoroughly bored Rosa. "I need to speak with you privately," he said. Vivian looked at his face and told Rosa to take a break. They stood in the supply room with its shelves of salt and flour and preserved goods, and Wade pulled the papers from inside his shirt and handed them to her. She read in silence. He watched her face change as she read, not dramatically, not in a way a stranger would have noticed, but he'd been watching Vivian Harrowell for 2 days now, and he was beginning to understand her register. The slight tightening around the eyes, the breath that came out slower than it went in. When she finished, she stood holding the papers and looking at the shelf of flour sacks across from her. 6 months, she said, give or take. They'd have had it. Her voice was flat. not broken something harder than broken. Angry in the cold way of someone who doesn't go to anger easily and is more dangerous for it. If you hadn't come back, if I hadn't seen what happened in the yard, they'd have had it, and I would have believed it was my own failure. Yes. She turned to look at him. How do we stop it? We take this to the sheriff and we do it right. Not just the papers, we need corroboration. Harker's involvement, the Cornerstone supply payments, a record of the cattle that can be traced. He paused. And we need to do it before Brigg realizes the papers are gone. How long do we have? He gets back from the pasture check in an hour. Maybe a little more. Wade looked at her steadily. If he checks the drawer before tonight, we have less than that. Vivian held the papers for a moment longer. Then she straightened her spine in the particular way of a woman who has made a decision and is done deliberating. I'll send for the sheriff myself, she said. Tonight. And I want Calder Brigg off my property and in custody before he knows what's happening. It won't be that clean, Wade said. No, she agreed. It never is. She looked at the papers one more time. But we start tonight. Wade nodded. Outside, across the yard, a horse whinnied in the barn. The sound carried clear in the cold air. He thought about the letter, and Alderton and Laramie, and a scheme that had been running for 3 years while 32 families went about their days, not knowing the ground was being cut out from under them. Then he thought about Maisie in her room with the latching door, and Perkins mending a bridle at his workbench, and Rosa bored in the supply room, and all the ordinary, counted lives that Silver Mesa held together by being a place that kept running. He went back to the horse barn and waited for the pasture check crew to return, and watched Calder Brigg come through the gate at dusk, with the careful, controlled face of a man who didn't yet know that the room he'd constructed around himself had just developed a significant crack. It wasn't going to be clean. Wade had told Vivian that, and he meant it. But it was going to be finished, one way or another, before Alderton's timeline ran out. The sheriff didn't come that night. Vivian's rider made it to town by 8 o'clock and returned before 10 with a message from Sheriff Olin Pruitt saying he'd be out in the morning, which was either reasonable professional caution or something less comfortable. And Wade spent the intervening hours sitting with that uncertainty and not liking either possibility. He slept badly. The bunkhouse was its own particular kind of quiet after dark, a building full of men pretending to be more asleep than they were, listening to each other not move. Wade had slept in bunkhouses for the better part of his adult life, and he knew the difference between genuine nighttime stillness and the alert, careful stillness of men who had something on their minds. Tonight it was the second kind. He was up before 4 again. Maisie was still coughing, but less a dry, periodic sound that had begun to space out, which he took as improvement. She'd eaten well at supper and had spent the evening with the bookkeeper's wife, a kind and scattered woman named Helen Garrett, who was teaching reading to her own 2 children, and had apparently welcomed a 3rd student without any particular fuss. When Wade had checked on Maisie before turning in, she'd been sitting on her bed with a reader open in her lap, sounding out words in a whisper, concentrating with the hard-bitten focus she applied to everything she cared about. He hadn't told her what he'd found in Brigg's room. She was 8 years old, and some things weren't hers to carry yet. He was at the water pump when Brigg came out of his quarters in the early dark. They looked at each other across the yard, 20 feet of frost-hard ground between them, the sky still more black than gray, the ranch not quite awake around them. Brigg's face was composed. It was always composed. That was what made him effective and what made him difficult to read. Wade had learned to look past the composition to watch the eyes, the small muscles around the jaw, the way a man held his weight. Brigg was holding his weight differently this morning. Not enough to matter to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. Just enough to tell Wade that the drawer had been checked, or the window latch had been found sitting differently than Brigg had left it, or some other small, telling thing had communicated what had happened in that room yesterday afternoon. He knew, maybe not exactly, but enough. Wade held his gaze for a moment, then went back to working the pump handle. He heard Brigg's boots cross the yard toward the equipment barn, and he listened to the sound until it was gone, and then he went to find Perkins. He knows something was disturbed, Wade said quietly. Inside the horse barn, where sound traveled differently than in the open yard. Perkins didn't look up from the hoof he was examining. How long do you think we have? Until he figures out exactly what's missing. I don't know. Could be today. Could be less. Wade ran his hand along the neck of the nearest horse, a gray mare who turned her head and regarded him with the patient, evaluating intelligence horses had when they'd decided to extend trust provisionally. He can't move fast without showing his hand, but he'll start working to undermine what we found. How? He'll say the papers were planted. He'll say I had access to the foreman's quarters because I'm trying to protect my position. He'll have a story ready for each piece because he's had 3 years of building stories. Wade looked at Perkins steadily. I need you to think about who on this ranch will hold steady if Briggs starts working on them. And who won't. Perkins was quiet for a long moment. His hands kept moving on the horse's leg, checking, pressing lightly. Dermot will hold, he said finally. He's quiet, but he's honest. The 2 Mexican hands, Reyes and his brother, they've got no love for Brig. He's shorted their wages twice, and they've never gotten the difference back. A pause. My nephew. He's scared of Brig, but he's more scared of what happens if Brig wins. Colm? Perkins straightened up slowly. Colm is Brig's man. Has been for 2 years. Whatever Brig has on him is enough. There are others like that, 2 that I'm fairly certain of. Possibly a third a hand named Jessup, who came on about a year ago. He took the position without asking about wages, which struck me as a man who had reason not to draw attention. Wade absorbed this. 6 hands who might hold, 3 who wouldn't, and a yard full of people who were waiting to see which way things fell before deciding what they believed. It was a workable situation if the sheriff arrived on time and Brig didn't make a move first. It was a dangerous situation otherwise. Sheriff Olin Pruitt rode through the Silver Mesa gate at 9:30, which was later than Wade had hoped and earlier than he'd feared. He came alone, which told its own story, a man who didn't feel he needed backup for a ranch visit, which could mean he didn't take Vivian's message seriously enough to bring it, or could mean he had some idea of what he was riding into and had reasons for not bringing witnesses. Pruitt was a solid man in his 50s with a grayed mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who'd been in his position long enough to have developed opinions about most situations before he arrived at them. He'd been sheriff of the county for 11 years, which meant he'd been there through Pryor and through the first year of Brig, and Wade had no particular read on him from prior experience, because his prior experience of sheriffs was mostly that they were less useful in theory than in practice, when the problem involved a man with influence. Vivian met him on the porch. Wade stayed back in the yard, visible, occupied with nothing in particular. He didn't want to be in the meeting. He wanted to watch the yard while it happened. Brig appeared from the direction of the equipment barn 7 minutes after Pruitt went inside. He walked toward the main house at a measured pace, which was either because he'd been waiting for this moment or because he happened to be heading that way, and either interpretation was possible and neither was comfortable. Reyes, the elder of the 2 Mexican brothers, came to stand near Wade without appearing to do so, drifting across the yard in the gradual way of a man with no particular destination. He went in there last night, Reyes said, low, not looking at Wade. After supper, his quarters. Was in there a long time. I know, he sent Colm to town this morning. Early. Wade looked at him. What for? Reyes shook his head slightly. Colm didn't say, but he took the fast horse. Colm on the fast horse, heading to town before the sheriff arrived. Wade thought about who was in town that Brig needed reached quickly. He thought about the letters in his shirt, the name Alderton, T.W. appearing at the top of those correspondence pages. He thought about whether Laramie was close enough for a rider to reach and return in a day. It wasn't, but the telegraph office in town could reach Laramie in minutes. Thank you, Wade said to Reyes and walked toward the main house. He didn't knock. He could hear voices from the study, Vivian's, steady and clear, and Pruitt's, and then Briggs', which had entered the room at some point while Wade was in the yard and was now doing what Briggs' voice always did when it needed to accomplish something, staying quiet, staying smooth, staying entirely reasonable. Wade stepped into the doorway. Pruitt looked at him. Vivian looked at him with something that wasn't relief, but was adjacent to it. Brigg looked at him with nothing in particular on his face, which was its own kind of answer. "Mr. Hollister," Pruitt said, "I was about to ask for you." "I imagined so." Wade looked at Brigg for a moment, then back at the sheriff. "Did Mrs. Harrowell show you the papers?" "She did." Pruitt had them on the desk in front of him, Brigg's hidden ledger, the letters to Alderton. He'd clearly been through them before Brigg arrived. "And Mr. Brigg has offered an explanation. I'd like to hear it." Brigg's expression shifted towards something that was not quite a smile. "The ledger is a working document. Cross-reference accounting a second set of figures I maintain to check the official books for errors. Standard practice in ranch management, is it?" Wade said. "The correspondence with Mr. Alderton is a business discussion. He's a land investor I've been in contact with on behalf of Mrs. Harrowell, discussing options for the ranch's future during what has been a difficult financial period." He paused. "Period that, I'll note, began worsening significantly in the past year. Since about when you started cooking the books," Wade said. "Mr. Hollister." Pruitt's voice carried a note of warning. "Sheriff, those figures don't match Silver Mesa's actual operations. I've worked this ranch for 11 years, and I can account for most of those discrepancies from personal knowledge." Wade kept his voice even. "The hay delivery in January, I was there. I counted the bales. Cattle count last April, I worked the east section myself. What's in Brigg's private ledger isn't cross-referencing. It's a record of what he actually moved and sold, separate from what he told Mrs. Harrowell he was doing." Pruitt looked at the papers. He looked at Brigg. He had the expression of a man who was genuinely thinking, which was at least something. "The letters," Vivian said. She'd been quiet since Wade entered, and now she spoke with a controlled precision that Wade recognized as the voice she used when she had decided to stop being patient. "Mr. Alderton wrote to Mr. Brigg, not to me. 6 letters, none of which I was shown or informed of, discussing a purchase of Silver Mesa that I never agreed to negotiate." She looked at Brigg directly. "This is a business discussion on my behalf. Why is it a secret one?" Brigg was quiet for half a second, barely perceptible, but Wade caught it. "The discussions were preliminary. I didn't want to trouble you with negotiations that hadn't reached a formal stage. You were managing a potential sale of my ranch without my knowledge, and you call that not troubling me?" "Vivian, Mrs. Harrowell," she said. The room went quiet. Even Pruitt seemed to find something worth studying in the middle distance for a moment. Brigg recovered quickly. He always did. "Sheriff, I'd like to raise a separate concern. Mr. Hollister was dismissed from this property yesterday morning for insubordination. He was rehired in an unofficial capacity without proper process by Mrs. Harrowell under what I'd characterize as emotional circumstances. He then broke into my private quarters. The window latch was old," Wade said. "Mrs. Harrowell authorized the search, did she?" Brigg looked at Vivian. "In writing? She owns the building," Wade said. "She doesn't need it in writing to authorize a search of a structure on her own property." Pruitt rubbed his jaw. "That's not entirely inaccurate." "I want Mr. Hollister removed from this property," Brigg said. The smooth had dropped about 1 degree, a barely visible crack. "He's been here 2 days, and he's gone through my private papers, made accusations he can't substantiate." "I can substantiate them," Wade said. "Give me 2 days with the accounts, and I'll show you every discrepancy against what I know from personal experience. And I'd suggest someone send a wire to Laramie to verify what Cornerstone Supply actually is and whether it has ever delivered anything to Silver Mesa." Pruitt looked at him steadily. "You're suggesting the supply firm is fictitious?" "I'm suggesting it's worth verifying." Another silence. Brigg was doing something careful with his expression, keeping it neutral, while something behind it worked at a problem. Wade watched him and thought about Colm on the fast horse, heading toward the telegraph office, and wondered how long it would take for Alderton to respond, and what the response would say, and whether it would be enough to muddy the water sufficiently that Pruitt couldn't act. "Here's what I'm going to do," Pruitt said. He gathered the papers from the desk with the deliberateness of a man who'd made a decision and was implementing it before anyone could object. "I'm taking these for review. I'll send a wire to Laramie myself this afternoon regarding Cornerstone Supply. And I'd ask that both of you," he looked between Wade and Briggs, "stay on this property until I've had time to look at this properly." How long? Vivian asked. Few days, maybe less. Pruitt stood, papers in hand. I'd also ask that nobody does anything in the meantime that makes this more complicated than it already is. He looked at Wade when he said that last part. Wade held his gaze and said nothing. Brigg left the study first, ahead of Pruitt, and Wade watched him cross the yard and go directly to the equipment barn. Came out 3 minutes later and went to the main bunkhouse, which was where the hands would be at this hour between morning work and midday meal. Wade thought about what a man like Brigg did when he felt the ground shifting under him. He didn't panic, Wade was certain of that, because panic wasn't in Brigg's construction. But he adapted. He'd had 3 years to build relationships and obligations and quiet understandings with certain people on this ranch, and he was about to start collecting on those. Wade went to find Reyes. I need you to do something, he said. Not because you owe me anything, because you decide it's right. Reyes studied him with dark, careful eyes. He was in his mid-30s, compact and capable, with the composed manner of a man who had navigated enough difficult situations to have stopped being surprised by them. What thing? Watch the bunkhouse. Watch who goes in after Brigg, who comes out looking different. Watch the equipment barn, whether anyone goes to the horses tonight, whether any of the tack gets prepared that shouldn't be. Wade paused. And if anything moves cattle, horses, anything leaving this property after dark, I need to know before it's gone. Reyes was quiet for a moment. You think he'll run. Think he'll do whatever protects Brigg first, and everything else second. Running's one option. Creating enough confusion to make the evidence look bad is another. Wade looked at him steadily. I don't know which he'll choose, but I know he'll choose something. And if I watch and I see something, then what? I come to you? Come to me first. Yes. Reyes considered this. Then he gave a single short nod that didn't commit to anything specific but communicated that he'd heard and was making his own decision about it, which was enough. The afternoon passed with the particular tension of a place that looks calm because everyone is working hard at looking calm. Wade spent it in the horse barn, which was where he was supposed to be and where he could think. He worked through the horses, methodically assessing each one, noting what needed attention, making the kind of careful record that a man who intended to be here long-term would make. Part of this was practical. Part of it was deliberate communication to anyone watching. He was not acting like a man about to run. Maisie appeared at the barn door at 3 o'clock. She had a book under her arm, and her color was better than yesterday, the cough having retreated to something intermittent and less alarming. She came in without asking, found an empty stall rail to sit on, and opened her book. They worked and read in parallel for a while, which was something they'd done many times. Wade occupied with some task, Maisie nearby with whatever she was reading or drawing, each of them comfortable with the other's presence without needing to fill it with talk. It was the kind of companionship that came from years of being each other's main company. After a while, Maisie said, without looking up from her book, "Something's wrong today." "Ranch business," Wade said. "With Mr. Brigg?" He looked at her. She was still reading, or pretending to. "Why do you say that?" "'Cause he walked past the kitchen window this morning, and Rosa made a face at his back." She turned a page. "Rosa doesn't make faces at people unless she's very worried about them. She made that face at you once, when you came in from the north pasture with that bad cut on your arm that you were pretending wasn't as bad as it was." Wade found himself caught somewhere between amusement and the particular feeling he always got when Maisie demonstrated that she'd been paying attention to things he hadn't known she was watching. "You notice a lot," he said. "I don't have much else to do when you're working." She finally looked up. "Going to be bad? Might get complicated. But you're handling it. Mrs. Harrowell and I together." "Yes." She looked at him steadily for a moment with Clara's eyes. "Do you trust her?" It was a direct question, and she meant it directly, and she deserved a direct answer. "More than I expected to," he said, which isn't the same as completely. "But it's enough for now." Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her book. Complication arrived that evening in the form of 3 men Wade didn't recognize riding through Silver Mesa's gate at dusk. He was crossing the yard when they came in. He stopped, watched them without appearing to watch. Dismounted with the ease of men who rode frequently, hitched their horses to the post by the main house, and went inside without stopping to announce themselves to anyone in the yard, which meant either Vivian was expecting them, or they were expected by someone else. He waited. Reyes materialized beside him in the quiet, focused way that Wade was coming to appreciate. "You know them?" Wade asked. "The one in the gray coat was in town last week with Brigg," Reyes said. "At the saloon. I was there with my brother." Brigg introduced him to Harker. Harker, the neighboring cattleman whose herd had mysteriously recovered 2 winters ago, whose name appeared 6 times in Brigg's private ledger. "Just the one? The other 2 I don't know. But the gray coat man, he came from the direction of the Laramie Road." Wade thought about the timeline. Colm on the fast horse to the telegraph this morning. Fonts Weisard back. A man who'd apparently been in the region already, perhaps in town, perhaps waiting for exactly this kind of message. Riding out to Silver Mesa before dark. Not Alderton himself, a man like Alderton didn't ride out personally for the dirty work. But someone connected to him closely enough to move fast when called. He went inside. He found them in the main sitting room, Vivian standing near the fireplace, her back's straight in the way that meant she was working at staying composed, and 2 of the 3 strangers, sitting in chairs, with the relaxed posture of men who believed they held the better hand. The third, the one in the gray coat, stood near the window. Brigg was not in the room, which meant he was somewhere else in the house, or had arranged this from outside it, and either way his absence felt deliberate. The man in the gray coat looked at Wade when he entered. "This would be Hollister," he said. "Who are you?" Wade asked. "My name is Cutter. I represent interests that include a significant investment in this valley's future." He said it pleasantly, with the polish of a man who'd practiced this kind of conversation. "I understand there's been some confusion about the management of Silver Mesa." "There's been some clarity about it," Wade said. "Recently." Cutter smiled. It was the smile of someone who uses smiles the way some men use tools. "Mrs. Harrowell, I've come to make you an offer that I believe you'll find generous given the ranch's current situations." "I haven't asked for an offer," Vivian said. "I understand. But given the accounting irregularities that have come to light, the apparent shortfalls in your cattle numbers, the questions about your supply chain, I think you'll find that the value of this property is not what you may have believed it to be." He produced a document from his coat. "What I'm offering represents a fair price for an operation facing the kind of uncertainty Silver Mesa currently faces." Wade looked at the document without touching it. Then he looked at Vivian. She was watching Cutter with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something that had moved past anger into a colder place. The place a person arrives at when they understand exactly what's being done to them and are deciding what to do about it. "The accounting irregularities," she said, "are the result of deliberate fraud by my foreman, for the benefit of the parties you represent. Cattle shortfalls are stolen cattle. The supply chain questions relate to payments made to a fictitious firm that I believe you're familiar with." She looked at the document and didn't take it. "I would not describe that as uncertainty I need saving from. I would describe it as a criminal matter currently under review by Sheriff Pruitt." Cutter's smile held, barely. "I understand you've raised some concerns with the sheriff. But concerns aren't evidence, and the ranch's financial position is also something the sheriff is reviewing." Wade moved to stand beside Vivian. Not in front of her, beside her. It was a distinction that mattered, and he made it deliberately. "Along with private correspondence between your principal and my foreman, describing exactly what you're doing and why." The smile went away. "That correspondence is private business communications. Between a man planning to defraud a widow of her property and the agent executing that plan," Wade said. "I expect the sheriff's office will characterize it somewhat differently." The room had gone very quiet. The 2 men in chairs had stopped looking relaxed. Cutter folded the document back into his coat. He looked between Wade and Vivian with the calculating expression of a man rapidly restructuring his approach. "Mrs. Harrowell," he said, "I'd encourage you to think carefully. Whatever Mr. Hollister believes he's found, these things have a way of becoming complicated. Quartz moved slowly. Your operation needs management now." "The offer I'm making is declined," Vivian said. "I'd like you to leave my property." "A beat. Tonight," Wade said. Cutter looked at him for a moment. Whatever he saw apparently settled something, because he nodded once and moved toward the door. Two men in chairs stood and followed. Wade waited until he heard the horses leaving the yard before he let the tension in his shoulders release, very slightly. Vivian turned to the fireplace. She put one hand on the mantelpiece and stood there. "That was Alderton's man," Wade said. "I know. He got here too fast." Colm telegraphed this morning and Cutter was already in the valley. Vivian turned to look at him, meaning they anticipated this, meaning they've been ready to accelerate the timeline. They weren't planning to wait 6 months if something disrupted the process. He looked toward the window, the dark yard beyond it. "We need the sheriff back here tomorrow. Not in a few days. Tomorrow. I'll send another rider tonight. Send Reyes. Trustworthy." She nodded. Then she looked at him with a tiredness that had been behind the composure all day finally becoming visible. "Where's Briggs?" she asked. "Not in this room when he should have been." "I don't like that. Should we—" She didn't finish the sentence because the sound from the yard stopped both of them. It wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of the cattle pen gate, a specific metallic clang that anyone who's spent time on a working ranch would recognize without needing to think about it. The sound of that gate being opened. Wade was moving before Vivian finished turning toward the window. He crossed the yard at a run and came around the side of the main barn and found exactly what the sound had told him to expect. The east cattle pen gate open. 3 men on horseback in the pen pushing the cattle toward the gap. The herd beginning to flow out in the confused, unhappy way cattle moved when they were being pushed faster than they wanted to go. Colm was on the gate horse. In the dark and the confusion, Wade could see the shape of him, knew his horse, knew the way he sat a saddle. The other 2 riders he didn't immediately recognize. "Colm," he said. Colm pulled his horse around. His face was tight in the dark. "Don't," Wade said. "Not a shout direct even. This isn't what saves you. You know that. Get out of the way, Hollister. You're moving stolen cattle on behalf of a man who'll let you take everything if this goes wrong. Think about what you're doing." I said, "Get out of the minus." The shot came from behind Wade. He dropped to the ground on instinct, felt the air where he'd been standing, heard the round hit the fence post 6 feet to his left. When he looked back, he saw Jessup Perkins' uncertain third, the hand who'd taken the job without asking about wages on foot, 20 yards back, with a rifle pointed in a direction that was no longer at Wade because Wade was no longer standing. The cattle were moving. 20-30 animals through the gate and into the open ground beyond, and once they got into the dark with 3 horsemen pushing them, they were going to be very hard to find. Perkins' nephew appeared from nowhere, or not from nowhere, from the equipment barn, where he'd apparently been doing something at an unusual hour, a pitchfork in his hands, which he was holding not as a weapon, but as something to do with his hands while he worked out what was happening. "Close the gate," Wade said. "Tommy, the gate." Tommy Perkins looked at Jessup and the rifle and the horseman in the pen and made the fast decision of a 22-year-old who is more scared of the wrong outcome than of the immediate danger. He ran for the gate. Jessup swung the rifle toward him. Wade came off the ground from his prone position and covered the 20 yards in the time it took Jessup to realign his aim, and he hit the man low and hard, the way you hit something you need to stop, without being certain how much stopping it requires, and they went down together in the dirt, and the rifle went somewhere that wasn't in Jessup's hands anymore. Jessup was bigger than Wade and younger by a decade, and what followed was not dignified and was not quick and involved a significant amount of mud and an elbow that connected with Wade's jaw hard enough to make the night go briefly white at the edges. But Wade had been working physical labor for 20 years and had the grip strength that came from it, and eventually Jessup ran out of leverage and was face down in the dirt with Wade's knee in his back. "Stay," Wade said, breathing hard. Tommy had gotten the gate. Half the cattle were out, but half were not, and the 3 horsemen were dealing with a reduced herd that was now confused about whether it was coming or going. Colm had stopped pushing. He sat on his horse in the pen, the cattle milling around him, and looked at Tommy at the gate, and Wade on the ground with Jessup, and something went out of his posture. "It's done, Colm," Wade said from the ground. A long pause. "He said he'd destroy me," Colm said, "if I didn't help." "I know. He's got papers on me from Cheyenne," he said. "Colm." Wade held the man's gaze. "Whatever he's got, it's not worth this. And when this is over, What he's got won't be in his hands anymore. Colm sat there for another moment. The two other riders had stalled without Colm directing them. Without clear instruction, they'd stopped pushing. Then Colm dismounted. He put his hands up without being asked, which was either good instinct or resignation or both. Reyes came running from the direction of the bunkhouse, his brother close behind, and three more hands who'd apparently been roused by the noise. Wade got up from Jessup slowly. His jaw ached. His elbow had a new acquaintance with the ground that it was going to remember for a few days. He was breathing like a man who'd sprinted 20 yards and then wrestled someone significantly larger than optimal. He looked at the open gate. The cattle that had gotten through were somewhere in the dark ground beyond the fence. "We'll find them in the morning," Reyes said, reading his look. "Some of them. Most of them. They don't go far and cold." Wade looked at the chaos of the pen, the confused cattle, the dismounted Colm with his hands up, the prone Jessup being collected by Reyes's brother, the two unknown riders sitting very still on their horses and evaluating their options. He thought about Brig. In all of this, the rush of the gate and the shot and Jessup and the cattle going through, he hadn't seen Calder Brig. He turned to look at the main house. Vivian was on the porch, having appeared at some point during the confrontation, holding a lamp in one hand and what appeared to be a shotgun in the other, with the matter-of-fact comfort of a woman who'd grown up understanding that remote properties sometimes required it. "Where is he?" Wade called. She shook her head. She didn't know. Wade looked at the equipment barn, the corral, the dark spaces between buildings where a careful man could move without being seen. Brig had sent his people to create chaos while he did something else. That was what the cattle move had been, not the plan itself, but the distraction from it. The question was what Brig had used the distraction for. And then from the south end of the ranch, where the winter hay barn sat back from the main buildings in the way of structures that contained things that burned from that direction, came a sound and then a light that answered the question completely. The hay barn was on fire, and Maisie was somewhere in the ranch compound. Wade ran. The fire had a head start. Not a long one, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, enough for the dry hay to catch properly and begin working through the stored bales with the particular enthusiasm of fire in confined spaces. The south end of the barn was fully engaged when Wade rounded the corner of the main building and saw it. The north end was still intact. The structure between them was a question that was answering itself faster than he'd have liked. He didn't stop running. The main house was behind him. He'd already checked it as he passed, taking the porch stairs 2 at a time and hitting Maisie's door and finding the room empty, bed rumpled, book still open on the coverlet where she'd left it when something had pulled her attention. He'd stood in that doorway for 1 flat second, with the particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself as panic, but simply reorganizes everything else in your mind around a single urgent point, and then he'd gone back out. She wasn't in the house, which meant she was somewhere on the ranch grounds, and the fire was on the south end of the ranch grounds, and Maisie was the kind of child who moved toward things that concerned her rather than away from them. "Maisie," he shouted, and the word got swallowed by the sound of the fire and the wind coming off the mountains. Behind him, he could hear the rat come awake in the urgent, disorganized way of a place responding to something that required everyone at once voices, boots on hard ground, the frightened protest of horses who could smell the smoke from the main barn. Vivian's voice somewhere, cutting through the noise, with a clarity that indicated she'd made the transition from witness to commander, which was something he filed away in the back of his mind, even while the front of it was entirely focused on the burning building ahead of him. The tack room was attached to the south barn. Separate structure, technically, connected by a shared wall and a narrow corridor that was used to move saddles and gear without going outside. If Maisie had been in the horse barn earlier and had gone to the tack room for any reason, and she had a habit of going to the tack room because old Perkins kept hard candy in a tin on his workbench that he pretended not to know she knew about, then she was either already out or she was inside, with a wall between her and a barn that was burning. He hit the tack room door at a run, and it swung open, not locked, not even latched, and he was inside and shouting her name before he'd properly assessed what was in there. Smoke was coming through the shared wall. Not thick yet, but present, gray and purposeful, seeping through the gaps in the old planking. The tack room smelled of leather and oil, and now, increasingly, of the particular sharpness of burning wood. "Papa." The voice came from the far corner behind the saddle rack. Wade crossed the room in 4 steps and found his daughter crouched on the floor behind a row of hanging bridles with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around something, a satchel, dark leather, the kind used for documents or correspondence. She was looking up at him with the focused, deliberate calm she deployed when she was very frightened and had decided that the best response to very frightened was to stay small and still and wait. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Her voice was steady. "I heard the noise outside and I came to see, and then the smoke started, and I couldn't tell which way the fire was." "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we're walking right now." He got his hand around hers and pulled her to standing. "That." She looked at the satchel. "I found it." It was behind the feed shelf, the loose board that Perkins keeps his candy behind. There was a space behind it I never noticed before, and this was in it. He didn't stop moving. He got her through the tack room door and 20 feet from the structure, and then stopped and looked at her in the firelight, checking her over with the fast, practical eye of someone who has been the only adult responsible for another person's safety for 8 years. She was fine, frightened, flushed from the smoke, but physically intact, and holding that satchel like it was something she'd decided mattered. "Give me that," he said. She handed it over. He opened it. Smoke and the firelight made reading difficult, but not impossible. He stood 20 feet from a burning barn with his daughter beside him and looked at what Maisie had found, and what he saw made him go very still in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. The satchel contained documents. Not the same kind as Briggs' hidden ledger, these were different. Bills of sale, purchase records for cattle, stamped and dated and signed. A ledger of a different kind from a different hand, not Briggs' backward-leaning script, but a rounder, more careful handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. And correspondence, more of it than he'd found in the desk drawer, covering not just Alderton but 3 other names he didn't know. He flipped to the most recent letter. The date was 2 weeks ago. The content was a timeline, specific, detailed, broken into stages. Stage 1 was the devaluation of Silver Mesa's books, which was complete. Stage 2 was the elimination of any party capable of raising credible objections, which was in progress. Stage 3 was the purchase offer, which was to be presented within 30 days. Stage 2, he looked up. Across the yard in the chaos of the fire response, he could see hands forming a bucket line from the water trough. Vivian had the horses she'd apparently made the call to open the corral and the main barn to get them clear of the smoke, and the horses were loose in the yard, circling in the agitated way of animals who understood that something was wrong without being able to locate exactly what or where. A practical decision that would cost time to reverse, but was the right one. He didn't see Brig. He still didn't see Brig, which was a problem that had been building since the moment the fire started and had not resolved itself. "Stay with Rosa," he told Maisie, pointing to where the cook had positioned herself well back from the fire with 2 of the younger hands and a look on her face that was doing the work of keeping them in place by sheer force of her opinion. "Give her the satchel. Don't let go of it. Where are you going?" "To find someone." "Brig?" He looked at her. "I'm 8, she said. "Not 4. "Stay with Rosa," he said again and went. Vivian was at the water trough, not directing the bucket line from a safe distance, but in it her good coat abandoned somewhere, her sleeves rolled, passing buckets with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who'd made a calculation about what mattered more than staying clean. She had a smear of ash on her jaw and her hair was coming down on one side. "Safe," Wade said, moving up beside her. The relief that crossed her face was fast and unguarded, gone almost before it fully arrived. "Where?" "With Rosa. She found something in the tack room documents in a hidden space. I need to. The fire's going to take the north end if we don't get ahead of it," she said. She wasn't dismissing him, she was doing 3 things at once, and managing all of them imperfectly, which was honest. Dermot's talking about pulling the east fence section to create a break. Do it. The fencing can be rebuilt. The barn's already half gone, the break will save the equipment storage. She nodded and shouted something at Dermot that Wade didn't catch. "Brig," Wade said. "I know." She looked at him. "I haven't seen him since before the cattle pen. He set this up." The cattle move was to pull everyone north while he went south. But the fire, Wade thought about the timing. He would have lit it and then gone somewhere. He's either still on the property, which means he thinks the fire gives him enough cover, or he's already at the horses. The road horses are still in the main corral. I can see them. Pasture horses aren't. A pause, both of them thinking through the same geography. The south pasture gate, Vivian said, connects to the valley road without coming through the main yard, Wade said. Yes. She looked at the bucket line, the fire, the controlled chaos of 30 people doing their best with an uncontrolled situation. She was calculating what she could leave, what she couldn't. Go, she said. I've got this, you sure? She gave him the look that had no particular name but communicated clearly that it was a question she didn't need asked twice. He went. The south pasture was a quarter-mile from the main buildings, accessible by a track that ran along the east fence line and came out at a gate that connected to the valley road running south. It was not a route anyone used regularly. The main gate was faster and better maintained, which was exactly why a man who needed to leave without being seen would choose it. Wade ran the track in the dark with the fire's light behind him, enough glow to see the path, but not enough to see clearly ahead. The cold hit differently when you were moving less of the biting quality and more of a pressure against the face and hands. His jaw still ached from Jessup's elbow. He ignored it. He heard the horse before he saw anything, not moving standing, shifting its weight in the way horses did when they were tied and impatient. He slowed, moved to the edge of the track where the grass muffled his boots, and came up to the fence line carefully. Brig was at the gate. He had a horse, not one of the corral horses, a dark animal that Wade recognized after a moment as belonging to the pasture string. A horse that had been loose in the south pasture for 2 days, due to a thrown shoe that Perkins had been meaning to address. The shoe had apparently been addressed, or Brig had decided it would hold for the distance he was planning to cover. He had a pack on the horse, a proper travel pack, not thrown together in the last hour. This had been ready before tonight. Whatever had happened with the papers and the sheriff and Cutter's failed visit, Brig had maintained a parallel plan. A horse, a packed bag, a route that didn't go through any gate visible from the main house. He was working the gate latch when Wade came out of the dark. Calder, Brig went still. He turned. He was still carrying himself with the composed precision he always carried himself with, which was either gen control or the appearance of it maintained by habit, and in the firelight from the distant barn, Wade couldn't be certain which. Hollister, he said. You can't get far enough, Wade said. The sheriff's coming back in the morning. Pruett's got your papers. And there's a second set of documents that just came out of your tack room that covers things your desk drawer didn't. Something moved through Briggs' expression, not panic recognition. The specific look of a man who has been outmaneuvered by a variable he didn't account for. Tack room, he said, hidden behind the feed shelf. Wade watched him. Where'd you think the sheriff would look first? A locked drawer or a loose board in a building you don't officially use. Brig looked at him for a moment. You've been a problem since the day you got here, he said. Not with particular heat observationally, the way he said most things. You made me one, Wade said, when you put your hands on my daughter. That was a miscalculation. Most of it was, in the end. They stood 10 feet apart in the dark by the south pasture gate, with a fire burning behind them, and the horse shifting between them. And Wade was had been aware, since he'd come around the fence line, that he'd come here without a weapon. Which was the kind of thing that seemed obvious in retrospect, and less obvious when you were moving fast in the dark toward something you needed to stop. Brig appeared to reach a similar awareness at roughly the same moment. I'm going to leave, Brig said. You're going to let me go because your daughter is on this property, and so is Vivian Harrowell, and you're not going to leave them to chase me in the dark. I don't need to chase you. I just need to keep you here long enough. Long enough for what? The answer came from behind Wade. Long enough for me, Reyes said. Wade didn't look away from Brig. He could hear Reyes behind him, and from the sound of it, Reyes had not come alone. Brig looked past Wade at whatever was there, and whatever he saw apparently settled the calculation he'd been running, because the composure went through another adjustment, a small, final one, like a building settling. How many? Wade said to Reyes without turning. 4 of us, Reyes said. Plus Tommy. Tommy came? Tommy suggested it, Reyes said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite pride but was close enough. Brigg let go of the horse's reins. He put his hands up with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided that this particular fight is over and is already thinking about the next one, what he'd say to Pruett, what he'd say to a lawyer, how the papers would look when examined properly, and whether Alderton had the resources and the inclination to provide legal support. Wade could see him thinking it. Whatever you're planning to argue, Wade said, the documents in that satchel include correspondence signed by T. W. Alderton and co-signed by you, describing in some detail the legal status of the cattle you sold to Harker and 3 other buyers, and the fee structure you'd arranged for the sale. That's not cross-referencing accounting. He held Brigg's gaze. That's a record you kept because you needed to know where your money was going, and you didn't trust Alderton to keep an honest tally of your percentage. Brigg was quiet. You kept records on your own scheme, Wade said, because even in that you didn't trust anyone. It wasn't an accusation. It was just what was true. They brought Brigg back to the main yard with his hands bound with a length of leather cord that Reyes produced from his coat with the preparedness of a man who had thought this through in advance. The horse followed on a lead, the travel pack still on its back. Fire had peaked. Dermot's fence section pulled correctly, creating a break that stopped the spread before it reached the equipment storage. The south end of the hay barn was gone, a collapsed, smoking structure that would take weeks to clear and months to replace. The north end was damaged but standing. Vivian had organized the bucket line efficiently enough that the adjacent structures were saved, and she'd done it while keeping the horses from bolting and identifying which hands were actually working and which ones were standing close enough to look occupied without contributing. She was still at the trough when Wade came back into the yard. She saw Brigg with his hands bound, and Reyes and Tommy and 2 other hands behind him, and she stood for a moment just looking at the tableau of it. Then she looked at Wade. "The sheriff," she said. "I'll send Dermot tonight," Wade said. "Right now, not morning," she nodded. She looked at Brigg with an expression that was hard to characterize, not triumph, not relief. Something older and more tired than either. "Why?" she said to Brigg. Not angrily, actually asking. Brigg looked at her. Whatever his private thoughts about the situation were, they didn't surface in the answer he gave her. "Because it was possible," he said, "and because you weren't paying attention." It was cruel, Wade thought, in the particular way of a true thing said, without regard for what it cost the person hearing it. But Vivian didn't flinch. She held Brigg's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I am now," she said. Pruett arrived with 2 deputies before dawn. Dermot had made the ride in good time, apparently conveying sufficient urgency that the sheriff had decided against waiting for daylight. He came through the main gate while the sky was still dark and the yard still smelled of smoke, assessed the situation with the methodical calm of his profession, and within an hour had taken statements from Wade, Reyes, Vivian, Tommy Perkins, and with considerably more time and a quieter room from Colm. Colm talked. Once he'd started, he talked at some length, filling in gaps that the documents alone didn't cover: the arrangement with Harker, the names of the other buyers, the mechanism by which Cornerstone Supply had been used to redirect funds, and the understanding he'd had with Brigg about the material from Cheyenne and what would happen to it. "He told me it would destroy me," Colm said. He was sitting in the kitchen with his hands around a coffee cup, looking at the table. I believed him. "What's in it?" Pruett asked. Colm told him. Wade was in the room, and he listened without comment. When Colm finished, Pruett looked at the papers Colm was describing, and then at Colm. "This wouldn't have destroyed you," Pruett said. "The charges were dropped." "They're not on record." Colm stared at him. "He told you they were," Pruett said. "But they're not." The silence that followed, that was one of the more complicated things Wade had sat in for a while. Colm's face moved through several things: disbelief, recalculation, a dawning and furious understanding of how long he'd been carrying a weight that had been constructed specifically to keep him carrying it. 3 years, Colm said. "I know," Pruett said. "He wasn't unkind about it." "Tell me about the Harker arrangement." Maisie slept through most of the night's events. This was not because she hadn't been awake. She had been. wide-eyed in Rose's kitchen for the first 2 hours of it, watching through the window with the focused attention she brought to things she'd decided she needed to understand. But at some point after Wade had come back to the yard with Brig, and she'd confirmed her father was in one piece, combination of the late hour and the tail end of her cough, and the aftermath of genuine fear had sent her sideways onto the kitchen, settle with a quilt Rosa had produced from somewhere, and she'd gone under thoroughly. Wade checked on her twice during the night, once while Pruitt was taking statements. Once more near 3 in the morning when the yard had quieted and the fire was down to a dull settling glow. She was deeply asleep both times. Her color was good. Cough was absent. He stood in Rosa's kitchen doorway in the dark and watched his daughter sleep on a borrowed quilt in another person's house, and thought about the 11 years that had led to this particular night in this particular place, and what it had cost, and what it had produced, and whether the accounting balanced. It didn't quite. It never did in his experience. Things that cost you something didn't get balanced by other things in any way that was satisfying to calculate. But you got where you got, and what you had was what you had, and it was generally better to look at what was there than to spend the energy on what wasn't. What was there, as far as he could see it, his daughter asleep and safe. A ranch that was going to be damaged and difficult for a while, but was intact in the ways that mattered. A man in the sheriff's custody who wouldn't be in a position to do further damage to either. A woman somewhere in this house who had made a series of fast, accurate decisions under pressure, and who had done so without asking him to validate any of them. He went back to the study. Vivian was at the desk with the satchel documents spread in front of her. She'd changed out of the ash-stained clothes and into something plainer, her hair back, a lamp at her elbow. She was reading with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had decided to understand something fully rather than partially. She looked up when he came in. "Colm finished talking?" she asked. "An hour ago. Pruitt has what he needs. He'll go to Laramie in the morning today, I suppose. Alderton's going to have a difficult week." Vivian looked back at the documents. 3 other buyers besides Harker, yes. The cattle can be traced? Most of it. The bills of sale in that satchel are Briggs' own records. He was meticulous. Wanted to know every head that moved and what it was worth. That same meticulousness is now a detailed map of exactly what he took and where it went. Ironic, Vivian said. He trusted his own records more than he trusted the people he was working with, which meant he needed to keep them, which meant they existed to be found. Wade sat down in the chair across from the desk. "Your attorney will need to look at the recovery options. Some of those cattle may be back traceable through the buyer's own records. I'll write to him this morning." She paused. "There's something else." Wade waited. Some of what Brigg built, some of the operating agreements he put in place, were legitimately structured. Not the fraud, not the Alderton arrangement, but the way he reorganized certain routes and supplier relationships. Some of it was actually functional. She looked at him carefully. "I've been going through the operational decisions separately from the fraudulent ones. About half of what he changed in the past 3 years made the ranch worse. About a quarter of it made it worse deliberately. But there's another quarter that was competent. Genuine improvement. He was good at the work," Wade said. "That's part of what made him effective at hiding the other part." "Yes." She tapped one of the documents. "I'd want your assessment of which pieces to keep and which to undo. Once we're through the immediate part." "I can do that." She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Hollister, the hay barn, repairable. I've seen worse damage from a storm. The structure's framing on the north end will hold. We take down what's compromised, rebuild the south section before the heavy winter sets in. If we start in the next 2 weeks, we can have it weather tight before November. Do you know how to do that? I know enough to direct it. Dermot and Reyes between them know the rest. The cost. Less than Brigg was taking quarterly." He said it evenly. "The ranch's actual financial position before his adjustments is better than the books you've been reading. I can work through that with you once Pruitt's finished with the account evidence." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the quality of her attention that was different from the first 2 days, less assessing, less careful in the way of someone who hadn't yet decided what to trust. Not unguarded, exactly. but less defended. You repaired things on this ranch for years, she said, without being asked and without being paid for it. It needed doing. That's not an answer. He thought about how to say it honestly. I told you at the eating house. The ranch supports families. If it collapsed, the people who paid the price would be the ones who'd done nothing wrong. He paused. And I had 11 years in this place. It was mine in the way that things become yours when you've put work into them. Not legally, but in the other way. The more real way, she said. I think so. She was quiet for a moment. What Briggs said to me, she said, before Pruitt took him, that it was possible and I wasn't paying attention. She didn't look away from Wade. He wasn't wrong. You were grieving, Wade said. Same as I said before, that's not an excuse. No. It's a reason. They're different. He looked at her steadily. What you did last night, the horses, the fence break, the bucket line. The way you read those men and kept them organized when it would have been easier to step back and let it be someone else's problem. That's not a woman who isn't paying attention. That was one night. It's also not nothing. She looked at the documents for a moment. The lamp between them had burned down through the night and was getting low. I need to sleep, she said. And so do you. Couple more hours. At least that. She stood gathering the satchel documents into a careful stack. In the morning, I want to talk about the hay barn timeline and the north pasture fencing and what we do about the hands who sided with Brigg versus the ones who didn't, because I have opinions about that which I want your input on. In the morning, he agreed. She moved toward the door. Stopped. Mr. Hollister, ma'am. The workers' Brigg was the way he managed them. The wages he shorted. The pressure he maintained. She didn't look at him directly, instead at the middle distance in the way she did when she was working through something she hadn't quite finished formulating. That's going to change. The housing, the wages when a man is hurt. The children on the property. She glanced at him then. I want to discuss what that looks like. Properly. I have some thoughts on it, Wade said. I expect you do. She moved through the door. Tomorrow. He sat in the study with the dying lamp for a while after she left. Outside, the sky was starting its first tentative movement toward gray. The smoke smell had settled into the fabric of the morning present, but no longer alarming, just the smell of something that had happened and was over. From Rosa's kitchen, just audible through the walls, he could hear his daughter beginning to stir. A small sound, then quiet, then the particular soft voice Maisie used when she was talking to herself in the half-awake state, counting something, or sounding out a word, or working through some problem she'd been holding before sleep. He got up. The account books were still on the corner of the desk, both sets, Briggs and Silver Mesa's, stacked together. Wade picked up the hidden ledger, Briggs' careful private record of everything he'd taken and where it had gone. He held it for a moment, thought about the man who'd kept it, meticulous and isolated and unable to trust anyone, not even the people he was paying, and so he'd written everything down for himself because his own record was the only one he believed. There was something in that which was almost not pitiable. That wasn't the right word. But it was a lonely way to operate. To be good at something, genuinely good at the mechanics of it, and to use that skill entirely in the service of taking things apart, rather than building anything that lasted. He set the ledger down for Pruitt. Then he went to see about his daughter. Maisie was sitting upright on Rosa's kitchen, settled with the quilt around her shoulders, and the satchel on her lap. She'd kept hold of it through the night, which neither surprised Wade nor failed to move him in some way he didn't try to name. She looked at him when he came in. Did the fast, unconscious assessment children did, when they'd been waiting for a parent, checking that he was in one piece, that nothing was wrong in his face, that he was trying to hide. Over, she asked. The worst of it. Briggs, sheriff has him. She absorbed this. The fire? Going to need work. But it's out. She looked down at the satchel on her lap. I found it because of the candy tin, she said. Perkins always kept it behind the loose board, and I went to get a piece, and the board was different than usual. The nails had been moved. So I looked behind it, and there was the space, and the satchel was in it. Did you look inside it? A little. She looked up. I could read some of it, not all the words, but enough to know it was important. He sat down beside her on the settle. The kitchen was warm. Rosa had a good fire going in the stove, and the warmth was the particular comfort of a small enclosed space after a cold and difficult night. "You did good," he said. "I was scared, I know. And then I decided being scared wasn't useful, so I stayed still and waited." He looked at her profile, the dark hair, Clara's jaw, the set of her mouth that was entirely her own. "That's a good strategy," he said. "Perkins taught me," she said. He said horses do it when they're frightened. They go still and wait for more information. Perkins is a wise man. Maisie pulled the quilt a little tighter. "Staying," she said. "What do you want to do?" She considered this with genuine seriousness. "I want to stay. I like the room with the latching door, and Helen Garrett is teaching me fractions, and I'm bad at them, but I want to get better." She paused. "And I think Mrs. Harrowell is going to need help for a while." "She's going to need a lot of things rebuilt," Wade agreed. Maisie looked at him in the level, undeceived way she had. "That's not what I meant." He didn't answer that. "She eats alone," Maisie said. "I've seen it through the dining room window. She sits at that big table, and she eats by herself and she reads at the same time, and I think she does it so she doesn't notice how alone she is." "Maisie, I'm not saying anything," she said. "I'm just describing a thing I observed." He sat with that for a moment. "Get some more sleep," he said. "I'm not tired." "Rest, then." She curled back into the settle, still holding the satchel. He stayed beside her until her breathing slowed, and she went back under. And then he sat in the warm kitchen, in the early morning light, and listened to the ranch coming back to itself, outside the sounds of animals and work, and people doing the ordinary things that kept a place running, all of it continuing, as it had continued before, as it would continue after, because that was what working land did when the people on it chose to keep it alive. The hay barn would need rebuilding. The accounts would need unwinding. The hands who'd sided with Brigg would need decisions made about them, some of which would be hard, and some of which, like Colm, would require more nuance than a simple verdict. There was a lot of work ahead. Wade had always been better at work than at most other things, which had not always served him well, but was, at the moment, exactly what was needed. He picked up the coffee Rosa had left on the stove, drank it black, and waited for morning to finish arriving. Pruitt left for Laramie on the third day. He took Brigg, Jessup, and the two unknown riders in a wagon, with both deputies riding alongside, and he took every document Wade and Vivian had assembled, the hidden ledger, the satchel correspondence, Colm's written statement, and a separate accounting that Wade had spent 2 full days preparing, cross-referencing the official Silver Mesa books against his own 11 years of practical knowledge of the ranch's operations. It was not a polished document. It was written in the margins of a blank feed ledger, in the shorthand of a man who knew what he knew and wanted to be clear about where he knew it from. Pruitt had read through it the morning before he left, sitting at Vivian's kitchen table, and had asked 3 questions that told Wade the sheriff understood what he was looking at. Colm was not in the wagon. Pruitt had made a decision about Colm, a practical one, informed partly by the completeness of his cooperation and partly, Wade suspected, by the particular quality of Pruitt's 11 years in the job, which had apparently produced in him a working theory about the difference between men who did wrong because they wanted to, and men who did wrong because someone had constructed a cage around them and they couldn't find the door. Colm would answer for what he'd done, but the shape of that answer was going to be different from Brigg's, and Pruitt seemed willing to let that distinction matter. The morning the wagon left, Colm stood in the yard and watched it go. He didn't say anything. His face was the face of a man who had put down something very heavy and hadn't yet worked out what his arms were for without the weight in them. Wade came to stand beside him. "What happens now?" Colm asked. "That depends on some things," Wade said, "including what you want to do next." "You mean whether I stay. I mean whether you want to. There's no obligation either direction." Colm looked at the gate where the wagon had gone through. "I worked this ranch for 5 years before Brigg came. Good years. I know this land." He paused. "I know what I did." "So does everyone else," Wade said. "That's not nothing, knowing that. Some men never get there. Doesn't fix it. No. But it's where you start from if you're going to fix anything." Colm looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the south end of the ranch, where the burned hay barn waited for the work that was coming. "You're going to need hands who know what they're doing on that rebuild," he said. "I am," Wade said. "I'm good with timber framing. Did it before ranch work. I've seen what you build. Another pause. Neither of them was the kind of man who needed to make it more ceremonial than it was. All right, Colm said, and went to find Dermot. The recovery of Silver Mesa was not a clean or fast process, and Wade would not have trusted it if it had been. Things that take years to damage take time to repair, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either selling something or hasn't done the actual work. The hay barn came first because it had to. With winter coming down from the mountains in the particular relentless way of Wyoming winters, a ranch without covered hay storage was a ranch that lost cattle. And a ranch that lost cattle in November didn't recover until the following summer, at the earliest. Wade drew up a rebuilding plan the week after the fire, practical, prioritized, nothing that depended on perfect conditions or perfect materials. He designed it around what they had and what they could get in the available time, which meant some of it was rougher than he'd have liked, and none of it was going to win any prizes for finish work. But it would stand. It would hold. It would keep the hay dry. Dermot ran the framing crew. Colm did the timber work he'd said he could do, and he was as good as he'd implied, maybe better. Reyes and his brother handled materials and logistics with the organized efficiency of men who had strong opinions about things being done in the right order. Tommy Perkins turned out to be genuinely useful with a hammer in a way that surprised everyone, including apparently Tommy, who had not previously known this about himself. Wade worked alongside all of them. He didn't have a foreman's instinct to stand back and direct. He'd spent too many years being the man doing the work rather than assigning it, and old habits held. He did his share, and more than his share, and the men around him noticed this without remarking on it, which was the best kind of noticing. Vivian came out on the 4th day of construction and looked at what was going up. It's going to be smaller than the original, she said, by about 15%. We can extend it in the spring when we've got more time and the ground's not frozen. Will it hold the winter stores? Tight, but yes. We'll stack efficiently. She walked the perimeter of the foundation, looking at the framing with the attention of someone learning to read something in a language they were newly studying. She'd been doing that a lot in the past 2 weeks, appearing at whatever was being worked on and watching, and occasionally asking questions that were better than Wade had expected from someone who's previous. Experience of ranch operations had been largely financial. What made you confident it could be done in time? She asked. I've been looking at this barn for 11 years, Wade said. I knew its bones. I knew where it was solid and where it was marginal. When you know a structure that well you know what it takes to rebuild it. She looked at him sideways. Is that a general principle or a specific one? Both, probably. She almost smiled. It was a thing he'd noticed, the almost smile that preceded the real one by a beat or two, like she was checking whether the situation warranted it before committing. He'd learned to read the almost smile as the genuine expression and the full one as the confirmation. The attorney wrote back from Cheyenne, she said. Cattle recovery, Harker's already made an offer to settle. He knew the bills of sale were irregular when he bought, and he knows Pruitt has Briggs records. How much? Enough to cover the barn reconstruction and the wages Briggs shorted over the past 2 years. She paused. The other 3 buyers are being more resistant. It'll take longer. But it'll come. He believes so. She looked at the framing going up. Alderton is apparently a man with other interests he can't afford to have examined, and the Laramie district attorney is finding him very cooperative. Wade nodded. That was how it went with men like Alderton. They built elaborate structures that held together, only as long as nobody looked at the foundations. And when the foundations got examined, the whole arrangement became a negotiating position. Brig, he said. The attorney thinks 2 years, possibly 3. The fraud is clear, but the territorial court moves at its own pace. 2 years, Wade said. Does that seem insufficient to you? He thought about it honestly. I'm not sure what sufficient looks like for what he did. He took 3 years from this ranch and the people on it. He took wages from men who needed them. He kept Colm afraid for 3 years with a lie. He looked at the framing. 2 years in a territorial prison isn't nothing, but I stopped expecting things to be exactly fair a long time ago. Fair enough is usually what's available. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, she repeated, not agreeing exactly. Considering it. The meeting about the workers happened on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after Pruitt's departure, in the Silver Mesa main room, with most of the ranch hands present, and Rosa providing coffee, with the air of a woman attending an event she'd been wanting to see happen for some time. Wade had suggested the meeting. Vivian had organized it. They'd spent 4 evenings in the previous 2 weeks sitting at the study desk after supper, going through what it would look like, what could actually be sustained by the ranch's real finances, which were better than the doctored books had shown, but not so much better that it was a simple matter of generosity. There were things that cost money. There were things that cost less than expected when you organized them differently. And there were things that cost nothing except the decision to do them. Vivian stood at the front of the room and said what she had to say without dressing it up. Wages were going up. Not dramatically, the ranch's recovery was real, but it was also recent, and overcorrecting in the first season was a way to create problems in the second. But the amounts Brigg had been shorting were being made right, retroactively where it could be calculated. And going forward, the wage schedule would be posted and consistent, and not subject to individual interpretation by whoever happened to be running that week's payroll. Injured hands kept their wages for the duration of recovery from work-related injuries. This was not negotiable. A man who got hurt doing ranch work didn't lose his income on top of losing his health, because that was a way of punishing people for the ordinary physical consequences of hard work, and she wasn't going to run a ranch on that basis. The housing was changing. The bunkhouse was staying, most men preferred it, but the 3 family situations on the ranch were going to have proper accommodations rather than curtained corners and converted storage. Reyes and his brother had been living in a structure that was supposed to be temporary for 2 years. That was ending. Children were not nuisances. They were the reason most of these men were working this hard, and they were allowed to exist on this property without apology. At the end of the season, if the cattle numbers held and the recovery continued, there would be profit shares for the hands who had helped bring the herd through. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the quiet of men who were unimpressed, the quiet of men who were making sure they'd understood correctly and were deciding whether to believe it. Dermot spoke first. "What's the catch?" "There's no catch," Vivian said. "There's always a catch. The catch," Wade said from the side of the room, "is that we need this ranch to actually work. Which means everyone in this room doing the job they're capable of. That's not a catch. That's just what work is." Dermot looked at him, then at Vivian, then back at his coffee. "Fair enough," Dermot said. It wasn't an eruption of enthusiasm. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was a room full of men who worked with their hands for a living, deciding that this seemed like something they could operate under, and demonstrating that decision by going back to their coffee and beginning to talk to each other in the normal way of people whose meeting had accomplished what it was supposed to, and who were now ready to move on to whatever came next. Wade thought that was probably the best outcome available, and he was satisfied with it. November came in hard and cold, the way Wyoming Novembers did, with a seriousness about it that the earlier cold hadn't had. The new hay barn held. The north pasture fencing that Wade and Reyes had spent 2 weeks replacing held. The cattle that had been recovered from Harker and one of the other buyers were integrated back into the Silver Mesa herd, with the particular diplomatic difficulty of reintroducing animals who'd been somewhere else for a while, which required patience and a willingness to accept that cattle had opinions about these things and were not shy about expressing them. Maisie's cough was entirely gone by the end of October. She had conquered fractions, moved on to basic geometry, and developed a considered and moderately accurate ability to assess a horse's soundness from observation that made Perkins simultaneously proud and faintly suspicious, as though he wasn't sure how she'd gotten so good at it so fast. She had also, without any particular announcement or ceremony, begun appearing at the dinner table in the main house as a regular feature, not because anyone had explicitly invited her to make it permanent, but because she'd been invited once and then again, and then it had simply become the arrangement, the way arrangements did when nobody with the authority to formalize them had any objection. She ate with Wade and Vivian, and sometimes Helen Garrett and her children, and occasionally Perkins, who ate in the main house now, on the grounds that he was getting old, and the bunkhouse was drafty, and Vivian had made the offer 3 times before he'd accepted it, which was 1 time more than his pride technically required. The meals were not elegant. Vivian was a capable cook, in the way of someone who had learned to cook out of necessity rather than interest, and had gotten proficient without ever getting enthusiastic. Wade was worse, but he was willing, which in Rose's kitchen meant she occasionally directed him at tasks she didn't want to do herself. Maisie had opinions about biscuits that she was beginning to act on. One evening in late November, after a cattle sale that had gone better than any of them, had allowed themselves to predict not a return to Silver Mesa's best years. Not yet, but a real number that meant the ranch's recovery was not aspirational, but actual. Vivian made the sale ledger entries and closed the book and sat back in the desk chair with the particular quality of stillness that meant she was letting something settle. Wade was at the other side of the desk, going through the spring planning, what the pasture rotation would look like, where the fencing priorities were, what the breeding program needed to build back towards sustainable numbers. "We're not going to be behind come spring," she said. "No. I thought we might be. After the barn, after the cattle recovery costs, after the wage adjustments, I thought we'd be running lean through spring." "We're running lean," Wade said. "That's not the same as being behind." She looked at him. "You knew. I thought it was likely. I didn't want to say so until I was sure, because there's a kind of optimism that's useful and a kind that's just avoiding the problem, and I wasn't certain which mine was." "Which was it?" "Useful, apparently." She almost smiled. Then the real one. It had been happening more frequently, the real smile, the full version. He'd noticed this in the way he noticed things about this place, the way you notice changes in familiar terrain. He wasn't sure what to do about it, which was an unusual position for him, because he was generally a man who knew what to do about practical problems, and the question of what he was noticing in Vivian Harrowell had stopped feeling like a practical problem approximately 3 weeks after he'd come back through Silver Mesa's gate. He went back to his spring planning notes. She opened another ledger. They worked in parallel for a while, in the comfortable way of people who had gotten used to each other's presence across a desk and had stopped needing to fill the silence. "Wade," she said. He looked up. She'd used his first name approximately 6 times in the past 2 months. He'd noticed each one. "Maisie told me something yesterday," she said. "Should I be concerned? She told me she's been setting 3 places at the outside table every evening, even when it's cold." He was quiet for a moment. "She mentioned that the 3rd place was for someone who hadn't sat down yet," Vivian said. "She was very deliberate about not looking at me when she said it." "She gets that from her mother," Wade said. "Clara could have a full conversation with you while apparently reading a book. She's not wrong, is she?" It wasn't quite a question. He set down his pencil. He looked at Vivian Harrowell across the desk, that had been Briggs' territory and was now something else, a shared space, a working space, the kind of space that accumulates small evidence of 2 people occupying it regularly. Her coffee cup on the left side, his notes stacked on the right, a map of the Silver Mesa pasture rotation pinned to the wall that they'd drawn together one evening when the planning had required a visual, and neither of them had been willing to stop and find the original survey document. "No," he said. "She's not wrong." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at something they've been moving toward for a while and are deciding together whether to name it or let it be what it is without naming. "I don't know what this looks like," Vivian said. "I was married for 7 years, and he was a good man, and it was a good marriage, and I don't have any idea how you build that with someone who is nothing like him and everything is different." "I don't either," Wade said. "Clara and I had 11 years, and then she was gone, and I spent 4 years not looking at anything that wasn't my daughter or my work." He paused. "I'm not sure there's a way to know in advance. I think you just start from what's true." "What's true?" she said. "You're the most capable person I've worked alongside in my adult life. You make decisions fast, and most of them are right, and the ones that aren't, you adjust without spending time on it. You eat alone at a table that seats 12 and you read while you do it so you don't have to notice." He held her gaze. "I notice everything about this place. I've noticed everything about it for 11 years, including you since you came back." It was not a speech. It was not polished. It was a man who had spent most of his life saying precisely what he meant, because imprecision had costs he couldn't afford, saying what he meant. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "I notice you," she said. In case that wasn't clear. It was getting clearer, he said. The almost smile, then the real one. They did not rush it. That mattered, and they both understood it mattered. There were things to work through that took time, the particular work of two people who had each been shaped hard by loss and had each developed the habits that loss produces, which are useful habits in some ways, and obstructive ones in others. Wade's habit of solving problems alone, of not asking for help until the last possible moment, of treating his own needs as the last item on any list. Vivian's habit of managing everything from a distance, of keeping the operational and the personal in separate rooms, of mistaking self-sufficiency for self-protection when they were not always the same thing. They worked on these things the way they worked on the ranch, not by declaring them fixed, but by noticing them and choosing differently, and sometimes failing to choose differently, and then trying again. There was an evening in December when Wade said something about the spring cattle plan that was actually about something else entirely, and they both knew it. And the conversation that followed was not comfortable and did not resolve itself cleanly. And they went to bed that night with something unfinished between them. He lay in the bunkhouse. He still slept in the bunkhouse. He'd insisted on that and continued to insist on it for reasons that were partly about what was right and partly about not wanting to build anything on a foundation that was moving. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about what he'd said and what he'd meant and whether. The difference between the two was worth addressing. He got up at 4, the way he always did, and when he got to the horse barn, Vivian was already there. She was not a natural early riser. He knew this. You didn't have to. He started. I know I didn't have to, she said. I wanted to. He looked at her in the dim barn light, in her coat, her hair not yet pinned, a woman who had gotten up before 4 in the cold, because there was something unfinished that she'd decided to finish. I was wrong last night, he said, about what I said. You were partly wrong, she said. You were also partly right, which was the part that was hard to hear. Yeah, I do keep things in separate rooms, she said. I've been doing it since Arthur died, because if I put everything in the same room, I didn't know how to manage it all. And then it became habit, and I stopped noticing I was doing it. I solve things alone when I shouldn't, he said. I've been doing it since Clara because I couldn't afford not to, and then it became the only way I knew. They stood in the barn with the horses shifting around them in the dark. We're both going to keep doing these things sometimes, Vivian said. Yes, and we're going to have to decide that's workable. I think it is, he said. I think most things are workable if you're willing to keep at them. She looked at him with the direct, assessing attention that was one of the things he'd come to understand as essentially Vivian, not suspicion, not distance. Just a genuine desire to see what was actually there, rather than what was comfortable to believe. I think so too, she said. The gray mare in the nearest stall put her head over the partition and regarded them both with the patient, faintly judgmental expression of a horse who had formed opinions and was keeping them to herself. They married in March, when the worst of the winter was done, and the hay barn was fully complete, and the south pasture showed the first honest color of the coming season. It was not a large wedding. Perkins was there, cleaned up and uncomfortable in a collar that was visibly too tight and appeared to know it. Reyes and his brother, Dermot, Tommy Perkins, who had by this point developed enough confidence in his usefulness that he no longer looked surprised by his own presence in any situation. Helen Garrett, who cried, which she'd warned everyone she would do, and which nobody held against her. Rosa, who did not cry, and instead managed the food with the intensity of someone for whom feeding people was a serious responsibility. Colm was there. He stood in the back, quiet, watching. He'd been on Silver Mesa through the winter, doing the work he'd said he could do, and not making it more than that. He'd put in a full season of honest labor on a ranch he'd helped damage, and he'd done it without asking for acknowledgement. Wade thought that was probably what working something out looked like. For a person like Colm, not words or ceremony, but the consistent daily choice to do the thing you should have been doing before. Maisie stood beside Wade during the ceremony. She was wearing a dress that Vivian had gotten made for her in town, dark blue with a white collar, and she had her hair done in the way Helen Garrett had taught her. And she stood straight and held Wade's hand and looked at the whole proceedings with the focused attention of someone who had thought about this day arriving for some months and was now comparing it to what she'd imagined. Afterward, he asked her how it matched up. She thought about it seriously. Pretty much, she said. Except I thought she caught herself. I thought Vivian would cry. She didn't. No. Is that because she's not that kind of person? Or because she was happy enough that she didn't need to? Wade thought about this. Both probably, he said. Maisie nodded, satisfied with that answer, in a way she often wasn't with easy answers, which meant she'd already thought the same thing. There is something people do not tell you about rebuilding a thing that has been damaged, not the physical rebuilding, the timber framing and the fence replacement, and the restoration of honest account books. The other kind. The rebuilding that happens when a place has been used against the people in it, when trust has been made into a mechanism of control, when the ordinary human instinct to believe that the arrangement you're working within is basically fair has been exploited until people stop being able to distinguish between reasonable authority and the kind that's planning to take something from them. That kind of rebuilding is slow. It doesn't announce its progress. A man like Colm doesn't one day wake up and stop looking over his shoulder. He just, over time, looks over his shoulder less, and then one morning realizes he hasn't done it in a week, and doesn't know exactly when that changed. The young hands who were uncertain, who'd been uncertain for long enough, that uncertainty had become their baseline. They don't suddenly become confident. They become, incrementally, less braced for things to go wrong. And then some of them start to develop opinions about how things should go right, which is different and better. Reyes told Wade in the spring, while they were working the pasture rotation, that his brother was thinking about staying permanently. He wasn't sure before, Reyes said. He kept thinking about going back south. What changed his mind? Reyes thought about it the way he thought about most things fully, without rushing to the convenient answer. He said he didn't want to leave a place where he was treated like he was supposed to be here. Wade worked that over for a while. Supposed to be here, as opposed to tolerated, or permitted, or valuable for specific purposes and dispensable otherwise. The difference between those things was enormous and cost, in practical terms, almost nothing to provide. It was mostly a matter of what you assumed when you woke up in the morning about the people around you, whether they were problems to be managed or people to be worked with. Brigg had assumed the former. Everything he'd built had been built on that assumption, and it had worked, for a while, the way things work when they're constructed from what people fear rather than what they want. It didn't last. It never did in Wade's experience. He'd been working long enough and watching long enough to know that a place built on fear was a place continuously investing energy in maintaining that fear, which left less energy for everything else, which meant it gradually got hollowed out, which was exactly what had happened to Silver Mesa under Brigg's management. The theft had been real, and the damage had been real, but underneath both of those, the deeper damage had been what happened to the people, the way they'd learned to be smaller than they were, to have less opinion, to assume that what was being done for reasons they weren't entitled to question. Undoing that took time and consistency, and a willingness to keep doing it, even when the return wasn't immediately visible. Vivian was better at this than Wade had expected. She had the quality rare, in his experience, in people with her kind of position of making people feel that her attention was genuine when she gave it. Not performed interest, but actual curiosity, the kind that produced follow-up questions. She learned the hands' names and situations, and used that knowledge in ways that were useful rather than manipulative. She made decisions visibly, so that the people affected by those decisions could understand the reasoning and trust the next one, even if they disagreed with this one. She was not perfect at it. There were days when the old distance reasserted itself, when she was managing rather than engaging, and the people around her could feel the difference, even if they couldn't have named it. On those days, Wade said nothing directly. They'd learned enough about each other by now to know that direct wasn't always the right instrument, but sometimes in the evening he'd mention something specific that had happened that day, something small that she'd done or not done, and she'd sit with it, and usually she'd know what he meant. She did the same for him. When he'd spent 3 days solving a problem with the east pasture drainage alone, and had arrived at a solution that was functional, but had required twice the labor it would have needed with one additional person's input, she'd pointed this out in the particular patient way of someone who had watched him do it before, and was going to keep noticing, until the pattern shifted. "You do this," she said. "I know. You're getting better." "Slightly." "Slightly is still movement," she said. He thought about that. She was right, as she often was about things that weren't cattle or fencing. Slightly was still movement. A place that was slightly more honest than it had been was still more honest. A person who was slightly less alone in the way they operated their life was still less alone. These were not dramatic transformations, and they didn't make for the kind of stories that got told around fires, where everything changed completely in a single moment of clear decision. What actually changed was mostly smaller than that, and slower, and more durable. The summer Silver Mesa posted its first profitable cattle sale since Briggs' arrest. Wade was in the south pasture when the buyer's payment cleared, and Vivian sent Rosa out with the news. He was fixing a section of fence that had been on his slip for 2 weeks and had kept getting deferred by more urgent things. He read the note Rosa brought, folded it, and went back to the fence. Rosa stood watching him for a moment. "That's all," she said. "What else should there be? Most men would at least stop working." "The fence still needs fixing," Wade said. "Good news doesn't change that." Rosa looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she found both exasperating and accurate, and went back to the house. He finished the fence section and rode back in the early evening to find that Maisie had, in his absence, organized a supper outside. This was a thing she'd been doing periodically since Summer started producing plates from the kitchen with Rosa's supervision and setting them at the outdoor table on the west side of the house, where the evening light came in flat and golden. And the view ran all the way to the mountain line. There were 3 plates, 3 cups of coffee, 3 chairs, and a 4th chair pulled slightly out from the table as if someone had sat in it recently and gotten up to do something and was planning to come back. Maisie was already in her chair, cutting something with the focused attention she gave to all mechanical operations. Wade sat down. "Who's the 4th chair for?" he asked. "In case someone needs it," she said, without looking up. He looked at it for a moment, the empty chair, pulled slightly out, waiting. Then Vivian came around the corner of the house with a plate of something from Rosa's kitchen that she'd apparently been sent to collect. She stopped when she saw the table. She saw the plates, the cups, the 2 of them already seated. She saw the empty chair. "Can I sit with you?" she said. And Maisie looked up with the grin that she saved for moments when something happened exactly the way she'd thought it would. "You saved your chair." Vivian sat. She looked at the table and at the 2 of them with something that was not performed happiness, not the version people wear for occasions, but the quieter and more uncomfortable and more real version that arrives when you've stopped expecting things to go well, and they have anyway, and you don't quite know what to do with that. The mountain line went purple in the failing light. The cattle somewhere in the north pasture made the sound cattle made settling for the evening. The ranch was doing the ordinary, continuous work of a place that was alive and intended to stay that way. Wade drank his coffee and looked at the view he'd been looking at for 12 years, the same mountains, the same sky, the same particular quality of late light in this valley, and found that it looked different than it had. Not because anything about it had changed, but because of what surrounded him at the table. That was the thing they didn't tell you, he thought. When you'd spent years keeping your head down to protect what mattered, years of making yourself small enough to stay, years of doing the work without asking for recognition, years of treating dignity as a luxury you couldn't afford, you forgot that it was possible to stop doing that. You forgot that the smallness was an adaptation, not your actual size. You forgot that there might come a day when someone asked what you needed rather than telling you what you cost. Took a long time to believe that day had actually arrived. Took longer to stop waiting for it to be taken back. Wade was still working on that. He suspected he'd be working on it for a while. The habits of a difficult life didn't dissolve in one good season, and he wouldn't have trusted himself if they had. It would have meant they hadn't been real to begin with. This was real. The table was real. The coffee in his hands and the mountain line going dark, and Maisie asking Vivian something about fractions that had been bothering her, and Vivian answering it with the patient precision she gave to anything. Maisie asked all of it was real, and none of it had required him to become someone different from who he was. That was perhaps the thing worth saying, if there was a thing worth saying. That the life that became worth living was not the one he'd built by making himself useful enough to be tolerated. It was the one that started the day he refused to let another man put his hands on his daughter, even knowing what it would cost. He hadn't chosen the cost, but he'd chosen the line. And everything worth having had been on the other side of it. Later after supper, after Maisie had gone inside, and the last of the evening light had gone from the mountains, and the temperature was doing what Wyoming temperatures did when darkness fell, Vivian sat with her coffee going cold in her hands and said, without looking at him, "Do you miss the man you were before all this? Before Maisie, before Clara dying, before the years of keeping your head down?" The simpler version. Wade thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to expect him to. "No," he said. "That man didn't know what anything was worth yet." She looked at him. "Do you miss who you were before Arthur died?" he said. "Sometimes," she said. She was less careful. She took things for granted. A pause. "I miss not knowing how fast things can go." "Yeah," he said. "That I understand." They sat in the dark while the ranch settled around them, all its animals and people and structures, and the work that would come with morning, and the season after that, all of it continuing in the way that things continued when you'd decided they were worth continuing. The empty chair sat at the end of the table. Wade looked at it for a moment and thought about all the people who had needed a place to belong and hadn't found one, who had been too tired or too frightened or too worn down to keep looking. He thought about what it cost to hold a place open for someone who hadn't arrived yet, and whether it was worth the cost. He thought it was. He thought it almost always was. The chair would be there in the morning, and the morning after that, and for as many mornings as Silver Mesa had left, which, if Wade had anything to say about it, would be more than any of them could count. He finished his coffee. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but he knew where they were.